Peace, family. Y'all know who it is. It's Dr. Bakari K. Lumumba, the progenitor of LumumbaSpeaks.com, a Black empowerment initiative where we believe we can gain competitive advantage by always betting on Black. Back once again with a dual stream with Beacon Network, the Pan African social media extraordinary and the home of African centered news and information. If you're watching, make sure you hit the thumbs up button. Thumbs up, thumbs up, thumbs up. Make sure you hit the subscribe and like button as well as the notification bell. We're here to have a great conversation with none other than the man, the myth, the legend, Dr. T. Hasan Johnson. We're going to be deconstructing anti-Black misandry, anti-Flat Blackness, and the 2024 election. Very quickly, family, before we get started, I want to make sure I properly introduce Dr. Johnson by providing his bio. And it is as follows. Dr. T. Hasan Johnson is a full professor in Africana Studies at California State University, Fresno. He earned his doctorate at Claremont Graduate University, his master's at Temple University, and his bachelor's at California State University, Dominguez Hills. He has founded numerous federal state programs, including Africana Studies, online teleconference on Black male studies, the Onyx Black Male Film Festival, the Black Popular Cultural Lecture Series, and online research archive, the Onyx Black Male Collective, the annual Ash Sankofa Black Film Festival, the annual Africana Studies Black Gender Conference, the Africana Studies Black Elder Project, the Hip Hop Research and Interview Project, the Black Male Studies blog at www.newblackmasculinities.wordpress.com, and the Online Institute for Black Male Studies. Finally, in 2019, he created the Honors Report on YouTube and Inner Light Radio. Dr. Johnson was also part of the founding team for the African American Edge Initiative in the development of both the annual Harambe Retreat and the Office of Black Student Success at California State University, Fresno. As a graduate student, Dr. Johnson was awarded the prestigious Ford Dissertation Diversity Fellowship in 2006. In 2013, he was conferred both the Provost Award for Promising New Faculty and the inaugural Fresno State Talks Lecture Series Award in 2013, while receiving a Cost Teaching Award the following year. He has made contributions to esteemed journals such as the International Journal of Africana Studies, Spectrum, a journal for Black men, and books such as Jay-Z, Essays on Hip Hop, Philosophers, King, Icons of Hip Hop, and Dropping Knowledge, Hip Hop Pedagogy in the Academy. He is the developer of the concept of Black masculinism and frequently publishes on anti-Black misandry, anti-Black male heterophobia, interracial misandry, and white supremacy. His first book, You Must Learn, we're talking about KRS-One now, a primer for the study of hip-hop, examines the social political histories that contribute to the development of hip-hop culture and creates new theoretical frameworks for understanding its development. His current book, titled Solutions for Anti-Black Misandry, Blackness, and Black Male Death, The Black Masculinist Turn, and a New Paradigm for Studying Black Males, focuses on creating new paradigm for studying Black males that challenges widely accepted stereotypes regarding Black males with contemporary data and new conceptual theory, while also providing solutions for structural anti-Black misandry. Please put a virtual hand together for your favorite professor's favorite professor and your favorite scholar's favorite scholar, none other than Dr. T. Hasan Johnson. Dr. Johnson, how are you doing today?
I'm well, man. Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you for that introduction.
No problem. No problem. No problem. So tell us a little bit about yourself. What inspired your work, and why is there a need for Black male studies?
Well, sometimes you kind of trip into your work. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Just like when you were pointing out, some of my early work was on hip hop. When I was hired at Fresno State, I was hired to teach hip hop. That was one of the areas I was initially in. But what I really ended up finding out on the back end was that the real reason I was in hip hop was to study Black men and Black males, I should say, boys and men. I didn't know that at the time. You know what I mean? So I'm just teaching hip hop and I enjoy it. But I found that the more I got into it, what I was drawn to was this Black male experience more so than hip hop itself. And so as I started to kind of go into that, I kind of focused more on that. So, when you finish your doctorate, you kind of think what you kind of want to do. But at least in my experience, it took another 5 or 6 years after the doctorate of just teaching and working and really pushing myself to find out what I'm interested in before you really figure that out. And then you have experiences that kind of back that up. So having some Black male students go through a few things on my campus really helped me kind of highlight what it is I was drawn to do, what I was here to do, what I was most interested in. Because as you know, these brothers go through it. You know,
Absolutely.
in our own way, and I'm watching the younger generation go through it, which, by the way, is why I chose to be at a Fresno State, because those are the kinds of schools I went to. As you pointed out, I went to Cal State Dominguez Hills. So I wanted to go to a state university because I was looking for students like myself that really had a hard time finding support, finding mentorship, so on and so forth. So I wanted to be able to provide what was provided to me, um, but was still hard to find. You know what I mean? I didn't have a black male teacher until my second year of college,
Right.
as far as my entire life. So that's one of the reasons I came to Fresno State, and I sought out black male students and saw the things that they were dealing with, and it just really kind of let me know that's where I wanted to go. As far as black male studies, I think people assume, and this is something I've heard in Africana studies for years before I even got into black male studies formally. But this kind of idea that we know all there is to know about black males.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about incarceration. We might talk about the crack era. That's enough. We know enough. We know the black male experience. That's the assumption people make. And it's not really until we delve in and find out that we're just skimming the surface of the black male experience. So that's one of the reasons that I'm an advocate for black male studies, because even though within Africana studies, the assumption is that this work has been done, black males have been studied enough, move out the way. Now we need to focus on others. I really find that those the study that what people think they know about black males is just surface.
Understood. Very good. So a lot of your work, you talk about the intersection of race, gender, and public policy. Why is policy important? Right? Typically when we have these conversations, people think of the manosphere, but you don't think of policy intersecting or even being centered to the conversation regarding issues black men face.
Well, policy is huge, man. I mean, policy is one of the major factors that shapes behavior, among other things. But the area I tend to look at is how it shapes behavior across generations over time.
Okay.
You know what I mean? So if you have policy backing certain kinds of things, if you have resources going to certain types of things, and then, of course, a lack of policy in other areas, a lack of resources in other areas, you tend to find that people's behavior shifts dramatically. And this is one of the reasons that on the Onyx Report, in the last 4 years, we created a black male political agenda that is up. It is free. It is freely accessible. You Google it. It's on my blog, newblackmasculinities.wordpress.com. And it's a pinned article up there. And it's a living document, so people can add to it at any time. If you have any policy idea that will improve the life of black males across age, across class, across occupation, so on and so forth, propose it. All I need is 3 to 5 sentences and a few data links to back it up, and we'll go from there. But right now we're at 18 points on that agenda. Some of those have many sub points. And the idea behind it is to frame what kind of policies would improve the quality of life for black males. So that said, that's what we're pushing to do. The agenda is now available in a PDF form you can download right there on that website as well. And we're sharing it because when people ask black males, what it is you want, especially every presidential run, much of the time, black men are still talking about the community. We don't really talk about ourselves and our needs. We talk about what's best for community. But when you listen to other demographics, whether it's black LGBT or black women, they can speak very specifically about their particular needs. Most black males generically speak on behalf of the community because we've never been taught to reflect on our needs separate from any other demographic. And I've even had brothers tell me we don't have any needs separate from any other demographic. And I always challenge them. I say, okay, take the very first point on the black male political agenda and have a conversation with the women in your family and see how far that goes.
Right.
You will find out very quickly how severely some of our political needs and worldview differ from other demographics in our own community. And we need to be able to articulate those needs for our own, benefit. So as far as the role of policy, we got plenty of time to kind of flesh it out, but I'll just start with saying it's incredibly important. Is even just knowing what your policy interests are is incredibly important, but understanding how policy has impacted your community. I mean, we can talk about the impact of policy in terms of military service, in terms of the draft. We could talk about it in terms of welfare. We can talk about it. There's so many levels. We talk about it in terms of incarceration. There's so many different aspects of policy that directly impact the black community. and particularly on gender terms, the Black male experience, that we need to tease that out. So it goes beyond dating preferences, it goes beyond social issues, it goes beyond even, I mean, economic needs are in there as well, but we really have to incorporate policy into our discussions because they play a huge role in what goes on. I mean, you know, I remember when Biden, before he was elected, you know, a lot of people didn't want to talk about the role he played in policy in terms of incarceration in the early 90s. Tell me that didn't have a huge effect. How many people listening either went to prison or had a family member or friend or an associate that went to prison under those kind of policies? What, you know, and how does that affect things years later? These policy issues we have to incorporate into our analysis of our condition and how we engage society, because it is crucial that we understand how much they impact us.
Absolutely. So just very quickly, family, this conversation is going to center the work of Dr. Johnson's latest book, Solutions for Anti-Black Misandry, Flat Blackness, and Black Male Death, the Black Masculinist Turn. I will put the link to, of course, this book in the chat if you all are interested in, of course, purchasing, of course, his latest book. I have the book here. I've read it. It's a great read. As I told him, he was in his bag. Okay, so I would argue you definitely want to check out his latest book, right? And so we're going to get into that. So let's dig a little deeper. The Black gynocracy and the weaponization of the Black family against Black men. How is the gynocracy different from matriarchy?
Well, matriarchy, as we traditionally understand it, is, you know, a woman-led society, and to the extent that, you know, people of African descent have engaged matriarchy, it doesn't come across the way people think. I think people assume at first you start with a patriarchy, which is male-led, and a matriarchy is female-led. But
right,
really, when you start talking about a female patriarchy, we'll get to that in a second. That's a different thing. Matriarchy generally doesn't function the way people assume. It is women-led, and especially in terms of the family, but they often use men in terms of the actual hands-on leadership, despite that the women had say and influence over those men, you know, depending on what particular West African culture or whatnot you want to talk about. As we understand matriarchy, though, it really comes down to the elder women, right? That make decisions.
Right.
You know, but gynocracy is a little different. We talk about gynocracy in a couple of different ways. One, it's not really based on status, elder status, age, so on and so forth. It's a focus on females. There was a video some years ago I put on my Facebook page. It was a brother. He's probably a few years younger than me, and he was telling a story in his family about, you know, about this decision making about the family reunion they were going to have, and so on and so forth. And he said one day he noticed his younger sister, his baby sister, walked up to him and told him, "Well, you need to bring cups and chips, and you need to do this, and this is the time you need to be there." And he said, "You know, this is interesting." He said, "How exactly did my baby sister get rank and authority over me in my family?"
I remember you talking about that. And this is a brother who was in his late 20s, had a master's degree. I think he maybe even a law degree. His baby sister's still in high school.
I didn't remember the ages, but it was funny. And a lot of brothers were commenting like, "Yeah, that happened to me too." You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But the idea, though, in the Black family, most particularly, and we can get into this as we continue the conversation, that much of the time the authority is kind of passed to the women. And the assumption is that the men are just going to follow, they're going to do what they're told, and so on. Like I said, bring chips and cups.
Right.
That's kind of and so he was commenting on that, and you saw so many men saying, "Yeah, I noticed the same thing in my family. I noticed the same thing in my." So it's not really that it's based on eldership as far as when we talk about a gynocracy. It's really based in the female and the role and position she plays in the Black family here in the United States. The other way we describe the gynocracy is as a female patriarchy. And this is not a naturally forming kind of thing. I mean, at the end of the day, what we understand as the Black gynocracy is really in many ways shaped by white society here in America. It's financed by white society, and it depends on what era you want to look at to understand how it's developed over time. Because we can go back to the enslavement experience on plantations. We can go to the 1950s and 60s in terms of the imposition of the welfare state. And the man in the house rule. We can talk about it during the drug era.
Yes.
You know, there's so many different, so this is something that snowballs and develops over time, but we've reached a point where you actually at a point where you have grandmother to mother to daughter to granddaughter in terms of certain ideas about female leadership in the family, about access to consistent employment, right? And the impact that has on decision making and family formation, so on and so forth. So there's a material, policy influenced status that Black women have that offer them a degree more stability than Black men in society, that has helped to buoy along their kind of position in the family. And this is backed by other issues that compound the problem. And like I said, this is not, this is very superficial. I'm just kind of giving an introductory answer to this, and we could tease out as we go. But, these are the kind of things that form the kind of family as we understand it now. And it's continuing to replicate in that fashion. And by that, this is how you end up with a gynocracy. So much so that when you look at, say, the Democrat Party, and when they start to talk about who they're going to access in the Black community to discuss things, to develop policy for, who they're going to target as the head of the community to make decisions, you start to notice who they're talking to and who they're not talking to.
Right. And you mentioned that with Stacey Abrams.
Stacey Abrams
as well, yes.
And they're not talking to Black men. I mean, even Obama wasn't something Black men produced and demanded he be in there. Most of us were as surprised as anybody else when we were introduced to Obama. I mean, we saw him at the Democratic convention. He gave a speech, and then next thing we knew, we saw him in the debates, and we thought it was going to be like any other Black candidate, where they're mainly there to debate and bring up issues that white candidates wouldn't think about. And when it became clear he had a chance, we were as shocked as anybody else. And when he became president, and he was going around giving lectures about Black men and pulling their pants up and being, not being a deadbeat dad, he gave us this paternal kind of these talking points, but he wasn't produced out of our push. Whereas if you look at this last push, where they were telling Biden that he had to have a Black female candidate vice president, that was something Black women demanded. The Democrat Party conceded to. Now, I don't know how happy Black women are with who they ended up choosing, but at the end of the day, that was oppressed by Black women. And so now you have Kamala running for president, and then you have Black women in many instances supporting that push. That wasn't the case with Obama. That hasn't been the case for Black men. The way the party engages Black women versus how they engage Black men kind of tells you why the gynocracy is a thing, what is and isn't relevant about it. It's really that who they address in that fashion.
So Mr. Sandman says Black male misandry is solely rooted in interracial relationships between Black men and other race women. Black men feel betrayed. Black women feel betrayed, and other races feel threatened. So we will unpack that, but I would argue that is not the case. I've read a good amount of literature on anti-Black misandry, and I would argue it goes far beyond that. And we're going to get into some of those key ways that anti-Black misandry manifests in the contemporary society. In fact, Dr. Johnson's book touches on 13 key ways that anti-Black misandry manifests. So keep that comment in your pocket, and we will, of course, unpack that a little bit later in the conversation. So how is the guy? So you mentioned this. How is the gynocracy supported by the white power structure?
Well, as I was saying, it's supported by actually. There's let me see if I can pull it up. Is there a way I can actually show something on screen, or is that?
Yeah, you should be able to hit a request to share.
Okay. This will only take a second, but I think it might be helpful. And to the audience, this is not something that the good brother and I rehearsed. This we're just having a conversation. So this isn't something I planned to show, but I think it'll be useful if I can kind of put it up. Excuse me. But there are a number of ways that we see it kind of manifest over time. And one of the difficulties, many Black men have is trying to articulate it. And even our fathers and grandfathers had that issue, because by the time, just before I wrote I'd say about a year or two before I wrote this last book, when I sat down with my father and I explained to him the results of my research, it brought a tear to his eye. Because he lived through the things I was talking about. But just like us right now, living through things, you don't fully understand it until you've gone through it, So that generation of men battled through something, but they didn't fully understand it in many instances. Right. And so when I was able to kind of share what it is he went through, it was like, damn, But But this is a blog piece that I wrote back in 2018, and you can see it there. It's called "Why Was Black Generation X Fatherless?" And I kind of argue against a lot of the stereotypes of that era and try to put some things into perspective. The reason I bring this up, though, is I start by kind of framing what undergirds a gynocracy. And so you can see these bullet points here, right? And these are just, I don't put them in any particular, list or rank of importance. I just listed them, right? So you got a female excused military drafting policy. You got.
And if I could just very quickly, because when you mentioned that, I thought of the movie that came out when I was like 12 years old, 11 or 12, Dead Presidents.
Okay.
Lorenz Tate,
yes.
Right? He came back from the Vietnam War and he was a completely different person, and that was due to PTSD.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And which is interesting because Kamala was just asked on a blog, on a podcast, if there are any policies that directly the law, determines a man's body and what needs to happen to it. And she said there aren't any, but she overlooked the draft entirely.
Absolutely.
Which is entirely male focused. So, we talk about drafting policies, but just as you pointed out, whether it's the Vietnam War, the Korean War, we can see the impact on Black men having a unique impact on the Black community in turn that doesn't reflect what we see in other communities in the same way. So, the impact of drafting policies on Black men is something that kind of allows, in certain instances, historically speaking, women to position themselves differently because they didn't have to go to war. They didn't come back with PTSD, so on and so forth. Welfare policies like the man in the house rule, right, which positioned women in many instances to be head of household as far as the state was concerned, and men couldn't. In some instances, men couldn't even be in the same state as their family, and there were families that had to negotiate his absence so the family could eat, so the family could have a roof over his head. Now it's popular to look back and say, well, the men weren't there, the men were deadbeat dads, but in many instances, Black families negotiated his absence so the family could have some kind of security, especially as we were migrating out of the South, coming out of sharecropping. We didn't have steady employment.
We didn't have
steady. Yeah. So, but that split the family in terms that is still irreparable to this day.
And I would argue that the argument you're making, and many people say, well, how is that possible? Because we're looking at, of course, this is during the time of post Jim and Jane Crow. Right. And so we know that whenever there are periods of perceived or even real Black progress is followed by periods of racial retrenchment. And so the argument that's being made is that these policies of the man in the house was something that was only germane to the Black community. Is that accurate?
Well, no, the policies were imposed outside, across race.
Okay.
But the impact on the Black family is different. Right, because again, this was part of the Great Migration. This is around World War II in particular, where those white soldiers were drafted into war, and the factories needed labor. So there were Black men that were allowed to serve, and that was a whole battle unto itself.
Yes, it was.
The Black men that were still here, they had finally had access to factory jobs, and that goes for Black women and white women too. This is really what spawns white feminism in the mid 20th century. Is you had white women getting a paycheck. For the first time, working in a factory during World War II. And many argue that because that's the same generation of women to some extent that really led the feminist movement in the late 60s. They and their daughters, but they finally got a paycheck, and then they had to get out of those factory jobs and go back into the home as far as middle class whites, to the extent we could use that term. So that said, labor played an interesting role right around World War II. But for the Black community, once that labor went back to white soldiers, many of us didn't want to go back down south. We didn't want to go back to sharecropping. So we stayed in the cities that we had migrated to, but much of the time we didn't have employment. So this is where you get the advent of the ghetto in many of these cities. And they just kind of pushed us into the most undesirable parts of the city. Sometimes they even built significant structures to house us in large numbers. And this is where you get the advent of the ghetto. Now, during this time, you had Black women that could still get jobs as domestics. They could still find employment. Right? They even went to, even going to college on a particular level. Black men, it was much more difficult. And then by the time you get to the late 70s, you have deindustrialization, where these factory jobs, the extent to which we could still work them, were going overseas. So you have this mass of Black men in urban cities that are critically unemployed. You know what I mean? And so think about the impact of the family. First, you're told you can't be present if your family's on welfare. And then, employment is dwindling dramatically, most particularly for your demographic, Black males. And now think about the family, right? So the father's gone, the daughter's seeing the mother in a decision making position, and this is what she grows up seeing. So what does she pass down? What has her
It's
experience?
normalized.
It becomes
Absolutely.
normalized, right? Especially when you got the Vietnam War, you got the Korean War, the Vietnam War. So men are going to war, some are not coming back, some are coming back damaged, so on and so forth. Employment is still difficult to find. Even the men that went and served for World War II, black men, only a fraction of them actually got what is it? The GI Bill.
Yes.
Only a fraction of them got the benefit from the
Yes.
GI
Yes.
Bill.
We're talking about when affirmative action was white. Absolutely.
So there was there's a material instability as far as the black male existence, and the security, to the extent we can use that word in regard to welfare and whatnot, is something that even the children are only seeing associated with women. And so you get generation after generation of this. And if you have a prison record or anything of that nature, your position could threaten the family's access to welfare, living conditions, housing, so on and so forth. So there's this tension that becomes very built in between black men and women that is fundamentally around policy. Because even though we're talking about welfare, we're talking about policy. Right. And the way those policies are written, again, the man in the house rule is very particular. They didn't say women had to leave. They said the father had to leave. And then they send in social workers. You saw this in the film Claudine.
Yes.
They're looking for razors that men use to shave. They're looking for shoes. They're looking for anything related to that might show that a man has been present. Right. So what kind of relationships are going to spawn from that? Right. So welfare is policy. Going back to what's on the screen, you got family court policy. Most particularly through the 70s and 80s, we saw a dramatic shift in how no fault divorce was treated in courts, alimony, child support. Child support became another form of alimony in a particular way, because it goes much beyond what the children actually need and goes into.
It tends to be punitive. I know.
Punitive.
Absolutely.
So again, we're talking about policy, right? So we're talking about, so we go from welfare and state support to family court. We can talk about birth control, where technologically speaking, this has a profound effect on the power dynamics of who forms the family. Because if you look at the birth control options for men to this day, it's like we're still starting fires with sticks compared to nuclear weapons on behalf of what women have access to. I mean, they have over 30 different options, 5 major forms, over 30 different options. And that doesn't include abortion as a particularly, as a tool for birth control. We're still dealing with condoms and the pull-out method and vasectomies. You know what I mean? So, in terms of that, there's a shift there in terms of how that can be done. And in many ways, that kind of weaponized men's nature against them too. If you're a 15-year-old boy having sex for the first time and you accidentally get this girl pregnant, she has the sole decision-making power over the next 20 years of your life.
Right.
And this is a huge, this is a major shift in terms of and especially before, we haven't even gotten to DNA testing at birth or any of that. So whose baby it is, whether or not she has a baby, all of that is in her hands. And men basically just have to wait for her decision. You have no say so. So this is socially speaking and sociopolitically speaking, this is a profound shift at a very particular point in the mid 20th century. You have Title IX, right? This question of Title IX and sexual discrimination and how it's interpreted in the way feminists wrote it, right? Even though the language of it is sexually neutral much of the time, the application of it is very much centered around women. Absolutely. So even though women can be aggressors as often as men can be, that is not the social understanding around how we interpret sexual discrimination.
Right.
And I write about the very particular types of sexual discrimination that Black men face that don't jibe with the popular definition of sexual discrimination, because it's centered around women, most particularly white women, but even to some extent Black women, and how that idea manifests. So when we think about sexual discrimination, we think of a man at a workplace telling a bad joke. We think of somebody, touching a woman's body without her permission, or God forbid, a violation of some sort.
Right.
But we don't know, even men don't know how to think about the ways they've been sexually discriminated against. And I'll just give you a quick one and we'll move on and quickly get through this list. One of the ways Black men are sexually discriminated against in the workplace, and this happens to women too, it goes back to stereotype. It goes back to the basic stereotypes of how each demographic is perceived. And one of the things that Black men suffer from is that there is a fear of physical violence that's associated with Black men, physical and sexual violence that's associated with Black male stereotype that goes back to the Mandingo, goes back to, these various Black male brute figures,
Yes.
going back to, literature in the 19th century around Black men. That fear is palpable. Now, Black women get it too, but it's not really a fear of violence from Black women. It's more a fear of disagreeability and argumentation and so on. But with men, there's a physical and sexual threat that's associated with that. So if you're in the workplace, for example, and you have people that fear you simply because you're there, right? And I've even had it happen where I've had students say that I'm a threat to them simply because I'm there. They're afraid for their lives.
Yeah.
Then to have some women say, I'm not only afraid for my life, I'm afraid he's going to do something to me sexually. Well, has he said anything or done anything? No, but he's there. And he scares me to look at.
Yeah, your mere presence, your person
you're
is
very
the
personal.
issue. Yes.
Yeah. So I'm 6'2", I'm over 350. I'm a relatively big dude. That is enough to scare some people.
And your son, I think you talked about, a 6'10".
He's 6'10", size 20 shoe with long locks. So he walks in a room, people are immediately afraid of him. And they think he's wondering how he can hurt them. I can guarantee you he's wondering what video game he wants to buy next.
Right.
But the fear in and of itself, right, that we generate, even in a workplace, where whether or not you're promoted, demoted, fired, or allowed to continue working, is often predicated on other people's fear of you, is a form of sexual discrimination that Black men in particular face, because it's rooted in the experience of people fearing Black men in regard to stereotype. We don't think of that as a form of sexual and racial discrimination. We live it. We're used to it. Those are the waters we swim in. And as a matter of fact, we've developed strategies around making other people feel comfortable. Right? You've heard of whistling Vivaldi and smiling.
Right, yes.
Black men will tell you, wearing glasses. There was even Godfrey, the comedian, had this little skit up where he and his boys are standing on the street corner, but they're all holding cups from Starbucks, right? And you see all these white people walking by feeling better once they see them sipping on these Starbucks. But these are all, even though it's a joke, what he's talking about is the extent to which we provide a certain type of emotional labor to others, in the sense that we put them at ease, and we know how to do it.
Right.
We know how to smile. We know how to take the bass out of our voice. We know how to dress a certain way, to wear certain things, to carry certain things, that talk about certain subjects over others. We have a whole list of ways of putting others at ease, right? This is a form of negotiating what is often racial and sexual discrimination. And we preempt it by putting people at ease before they even do something that may damage our position, our job, so on and so forth. Right. So these are things we experience. We don't even realize it. So, but that related to Title IX, we talk about the K through 12 system. When you look at who graduates, who doesn't, you look at the performance, you look at who goes to special ed in greater numbers, and it has nothing to do with academic performance. In many ways, it has simply to do with your presence as a Black male in the class.
Yeah. And I'm quite sure you're familiar with Dr. Jawan Kanjufu and his work regarding the conspiracy to destroy Black boys, where he talks about those issues, Black boys being funneled in the special ed. I think Julia, who's the brother who Nathan and Julia Harris talked about how special ed was just holding cells for the penitentiary.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Right. So when you look at who's graduating, and this is actually impacting people across race, you know what I mean? But it's still nonetheless gynocentric in the sense that the majority of people implementing services as teachers in classrooms, implementing curriculum, are overwhelmingly women. And in elementary school, it's over 90%. So when you look at it from elementary school to your doctorate, the majority of the teachers you're going to have are going to be female. Well, how are those services going to be implemented? How are people going to be graded? How is their behavior going to have to navigate? And what are the rules of the space? Well, the rules of the space are determined by the people that implement the rules. So in many respects, you're going to have a system that caters to girls. And the clearest evidence of that is who's graduating in highest numbers and who isn't. And when it comes to Black males, whether you're talking about expulsion, detention, or grade performance or special ed, we are overwhelmingly overrepresented in each of those areas. And it's coincidentally, even though it's not a coincidence, it's the group that white women in particular are most fearful of, are most uncomfortable with. We are the group that tends to suffer that. So when you start to talk about this K through 12 system and the extent to which it penalizes boys for essentially not being girls, and Black boys for essentially not being white girls, you see how the punishment it kind of forms in a hierarchy of sorts, where black men are at the bottom, black males are at the bottom. I talk about need-based financial aid, and if you've actually, done any kind of prison time, not having access to something like the Pell Grants, and of course, programs removed from prisons where you used to be able to get degrees, which makes it that much more difficult for men trying to navigate out of incarceration back into society, because now they can't get degrees in the same kind of way. The impact of that and the financial means to even go to school. I talk about affirmative action hiring, which is something in the 80s, which was a lot more, prevalent in the discussion, where black women had double minority status. So the first thing, though, is that this whole question of affirmative action at one point was targeted toward black males,
right,
because of our status and our lowly status, our inaccessibility to resources and employment. And white women took over that discussion. They became the preeminent group
demographic. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. So they became their own demographic. They became those that needed
minorities.
The greatest degree. They became, thank you, minorities, right? And from there, they were able to push that and really take advantage of something that wasn't technically designed for them, but they got the greatest amount out of. But
Absolutely.
It also went in line with white women as feminists offering black women an opportunity to advance policy-wise by forming a kind of a unit of sorts, this kind of sisterhood idea. And when it came to this question of affirmative action, even though white women are the primary beneficiaries, black women had a double minority status as women and black that corporations and even government could take advantage of. Black men did not enjoy such a position. And we're seeing something similar now with DEI, where DEI practices are overwhelmingly, when you talk about the people who implement these within corporations and whatnot, they tend to be white women first and foremost. But after that, you're not finding a whole lot of black men in those positions, nor are you finding a lot of black men who are directly benefiting, especially heterosexual black men, who I argue are kind of being treated as honorary white men in some circles. So
we're going to get into that.
So whether you're talking about affirmative action or DEI, we're seeing the same kind of treatment, where heterosexual black males in particular are treated as a problem. They're treated as those who are not most in need, and thus, on the outside of that. And then, lastly, I talk about media. And if, I'm not sure how old you are. I'm 50 as of last week. So I was born in 74. I grew up most particularly in the 80s. And I saw at that time the shift in media, right? I saw it. And I really should qualify that a little more. It's not just media. I saw it happen in a number of different areas, but starting with media, whether it was films, talk shows, television shows, literature, books that were coming out, and even in the academy, the idea of black men being a problem to black women was foregrounded heavily. And this is one of the things that compounds on top of policy in terms of the gender dynamics in the black community. You have generations of women who have grown up with media material telling them that black men are nothing more than oppressors. They're nothing more than those that are going to either oppress you, violate you, or destroy your dreams, even inadvertently. Even your own sons can cause this, right? You've seen this in film after book after academic class, where these ideas have been replicated. And in the 80s, we really started to see it propagating in just extreme numbers. So
yeah, we're gonna get into that when we talk about the preterm.
Okay,
you mentioned that in the book. Some would even argue we even seen it even in a more nuanced form towards responsible, successful black men, particularly when we talk about who's the filmmaker? He always dresses up as a woman.
Oh, Tyler Perry.
I mean, in his movies, some of the tropes are this dark-skinned, responsible, educated brother who has a white-collar job and is extremely successful is going to what? Shit on you, right? But the brother who's lowly, right? He's the one who's going to act. I mean, there was another movie I saw. This was around the holidays, and it had to do with this brother who was engaged to a sister. Her family ran a jewelry store. He was a police officer, a detective, and the brother wants to marry her. She turns down the engagement to be with a guy who was a street guy who had her brother kidnapped.
Oh, wow.
Right. I was like, this is nothing but propaganda.
Well, and we've seen that. And I think it's best characterized by the color purple, right? I wouldn't say the color purple is the first or the last, but it's definitely one of the most popular, if not the most popular And that characterizes the kind of media programming. And I use the term programming here the way it should be used, the way it programs how we see the world. And I
Right.
think with that programming, boys learned that we were inherently a problem for women and girls learned that men are a problem and can end you and so on and so forth, to such an exaggerated degree that I think it served to, just as the beginning point of a snowball effect that had that created real problems for mate formation. But my point in bringing up all of these different bullet points is, you asked about how the gynocracy is supported by white society, how it comes about. Well, this is how. It's not just the opinions passed from grandmother to mother to daughter to granddaughter. It's also supported by these real policy-based experiences, these materially based practices in society that coincide with the opinions and perspectives and experiences passed down from mother to daughter. And when the two come together in a way where somebody can actually not only find a job, find a place, but advance in their job. If you're in the academy, as a woman in particular, as a Black woman, and you're talking about how monstrous Black males are, there's a place for you. There's a way to advance, and it's very well established. If you're in the academy as a Black man and you're critical, even on empirical grounds of feminism, you will find yourself having a very difficult time, right? So it's only geared one way, and so these things work in a manner that I think advances women and girls on certain planes and holds Black men and boys back. And this is what we mean by how a gynocracy is basically financed, supported by white society in that kind of fashion. It's mainly through policy, but it kind of bleeds off into a lot of different areas.
Very good. So, and I think, and I appreciate you sharing that. One of the byproducts, I would argue, of a gynocracy is this concept that we know one called son husbands, but also husband sons. Could you first let us know what a son husband is and what that looks like?
Well, son husband, as we commonly understand it, is generally the biological son of a given woman, and he ends up playing an emotional role in his relationship with his mother that he really shouldn't. It's the role her man, her boyfriend, or her husband should play, where he provides a certain type of emotional labor that is really framed for an adult to play. But it's something that tends to be put off on boys, on children. And so you see this, in a lot of different households that are female led, where, the sons in that situation will provide the mother, and it can be more than one at that, provide the mother with certain type of emotional presence that really a child shouldn't be responsible for. It should be something reserved for her counterpart, her lover, her husband. But it tends to become required by a boy.
And I know you posted on Instagram a while back ago a picture of a mother doing a Spider-Man kiss with her son.
Yeah.
Right. And that would be an example of not only a son husband, but also some would argue maybe some sexual abuse there as well.
The majority of situations are symbolic. At worst, they can get symbolically sexual, and we hear about these tropes all the time, right? Where you get to an age where you actually marry a woman, and now your wife and your mother are competing for your affection and attention. That could be an indication of a son-husband dynamic, because the mother is looking for you to play a role in her life that should be reserved for a lover, right? An emotional role. There are times where it actually can become sexual, and incest is a feature where you have boys who are socialized into it. But you notice we don't talk about that, right? We have conversations about grown men that violate young girls, and we should, but we don't talk about the roles that older women play in the sexualization of young underage boys and men. We don't have those conversations anywhere near the way we should. And there are so many celebrities, for example, that have had these experiences, and even their experiences doesn't make the cut in terms of what gets us to really talk about these issues. So older women and younger men, that's a problem in the Black community, period, because it goes unchecked. So we only know how to be critical of it one way, and we ignore it when it's the other. When it's a grown man doing it, it's a violation. When it's a grown woman doing it, it's a rite of passage, and he's going to learn about sex. It's a problem. And you'll find that the boys have the same emotional and psychological responses to it that young girls have when they're violated by grown men, but we don't know how to talk about that. So that's one. But when you compound that with a mother who's emotionally and psychologically and sexually violating her own son by making him play a sexual role in her life that should be reserved for an adult counterpart, that's where you see the worst examples of the son husband. And
Gotcha.
it doesn't stop at a certain age. You can be in your 50s with a mother in her 70s, and you're still playing an emotional and, depending on the situation, a sexual role in the mother's dynamic. And again, it's not something we talk about. So, it kind of goes under the radar.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And
emotional incest is definitely
yeah,
a thing.
emotional incest. So one of the things we hear, one of the popular tropes is there aren't enough available black men for black women, particularly black men of status, right? Some would argue that's why black women said they have to date out. But what we find, and you talked about this, of course, in your book, um, this concept of the black community is the only community where even though men are employed, we still see the rise in, of course, in divorce and the breakup of the household. What is a husband son?
Uh, the husband son. It's so interesting how that my first introduction to it happened, and this goes back to this whole question of black men framing their own terminology. Nothing I'm talking about is something that most black men haven't seen in one way, shape, or form. But we haven't necessarily, always given things a language. We just
Right,
saw it and we just keep it moving. It's something
right,
so when you develop a term for it, once you introduce it, what I find most of the time with black men is the response is, oh, not because it's something new, but because it's something we all grew up with. We just never named it. With the husband son dynamic, the way that started, it started with a gentleman who's a neighbor of mine whose wife was divorcing him. And he was telling me about her and her friends. They were all six-figure earning women. And they were, instead of the typical trope of them complaining about not having men they dated, they were all married. But they were
mm,
all married to brothers who were ex-cons, brothers who were unemployed, brothers who went from couch to couch and had been doing so since high school. And usually they were younger than the women in question. So here you had 30 to 35-year-old six-figure earning black women who were dating men 10 years younger than them, who didn't have jobs, who may have been in and out of prison at one point in time. And so what they were doing was marrying men that they found sexually attractive, but also men who were dependent on them. So
right,
they were in control. They had control of the relationship. And one argument can send him out the house where he had nowhere to go.
right.
You know what I mean? So in essence, he became the child caretaker. He became the homebody. He essentially became the wife, as we look at it in the traditional nuclear family setup. But the problem that came with that is these women were also very frustrated and unhappy at the same time, which was contradictory, to think about. So these men, this brother who had approached me about this issue, he was asking why his wife and her friends were so unhappy and frustrated, because actually his wife left him for one of these kind of men, apparently.
Mm,
And so he was saying he didn't understand why they were so unhappy when they were in control of their relationships. And so he started telling me about the men. And he was saying the men had to ask for an allowance to go to the bar or to go hang out once a
mm,
week. And then they had to ask for permission. So there was this clear power dynamic. And it goes back to what I said earlier about the gynocracy being a female patriarchy. But it's this kind of dynamic where you see some women choosing men that they know they have a position over. One, because they're consistently employed, more so than the men that they're more so than black men in general, but more so than the men they seek out. And they know these men aren't going to be able to move through society independent of them in the same kind of way. So it wasn't that they didn't have any other choice. They were actively looking for black men who had these experiences, who were coming out of prison, who didn't have
right,
consistent employment. And one of the other things they often wanted was, of course, to be mothers. They wanted to have children, and this was an easier way to go about that. If you remember, just about what I think it was about a year ago, there were articles coming out about how little black male sperm there was in sperm banks, and how
mm,
women were having trouble, black women in particular, especially LGBT women who were looking for ways to reproduce, but they couldn't. Well, this is one of the ways that women who tend to have husband sons can kind of sidestep that whole issue. They find men who need them,
right,
and men who are stereotypically machismo in a certain respect, but in another are wholly dependent on them.
right,
Right? And so sperm is not really a problem. Reproduction is not really a problem. Those women will even marry those men. But what tends to happen is the divorce rate is what it is, right? We know that, the first marriage, it's over 50% divorce rate. 70 to 80% of those divorces are initiated by women. That doesn't change even for women married to husband sons. So they still divorce these men. And then these men had to find ways to pay child support on top of that. So
right,
she's making six figures. She's gotten the kids that she wanted out of the dynamic. She's decided to divorce him. He now has to find some way to contribute to pay some kind of child support. He's not in a position to take the kids with him because he has no consistent employment. This husband-son dynamic is a way that women can be in control. And whether or not it brings them emotional satisfaction is a whole other issue, because many of us are still been socialized in a system where the ideal standard is for a man to be provider. When it comes to high-earning women, it's interesting. They don't want to be providers necessarily. Ideally, they want men that make more than them. Excuse me, I think I hit the mic. They want men that make more than them, even though their money is their money and the man's money is the family's
Our
money.
money, right? Yeah, we've heard that before.
Works. But when they don't get that and they choose to have a husband son, well, he's not expected to provide. But when we get past the divorce part, he's expected to make child support payments, and she is in control of the family from there. So this is the dynamic.
Even access to the child.
Absolutely.
Right. And if she denies access, you have to get it. Oftentimes you're going to need a lawyer to file a motion for you, and that's more money. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
And if you're still not consistently employed, how are you going to do all that?
Absolutely. Subordinate male hypothesis, intersectionality, and the promotion-demotion thesis. So as we talked offline, I read your book. I mean, it's marked up like the subway in Harlem, brother. I mean, I got highlights and bullet points and underlined here and there. You make the argument that intersectionality, of course, we're talking about the brilliant work of Kimberly Crenshaw. She's from the great state of Ohio. Shout out to Canton, Ohio. Argues that Black women face a double minority status, right? They're not only Black, but they're also female. Well, they argue that as it was, Black men had privilege based on the fact that we were male. Of course, you've debunked that concept or idea, that belief. And so now you're making this argument regarding integrating subordinate male hypothesis in the promotion-demotion thesis. How does that intersect with this concept or contradict the concept of intersectionality?
Well, the subordinate male target hypothesis comes out of Jim Sedanius's work via social dominance theory. And what Sedanius does, which is so incredible, is he does this empirically. And he's not even really talking about Black people. He's looking at whenever you have a phenomenon of one group dominating, colonizing, and enslaving another, right? When one group dominates another, there are certain sexual patterns that play out most consistently, right? There's a particular role that dominant men, what he calls subordinate men, play, dominant women, subordinate women. He talks about these patterns. So you could be talking about Greece in 300 BC. You could be talking about Czechoslovakia. You know what I mean? His framework is really more of a human dynamic framework. When we apply it to Black America, especially during slavery, one of the things we notice is that those patterns hold true, which is that dominant men, there's a lot of different aspects to how it plays out, but at the end of the day, there is an ongoing war between dominant men and subordinate men that continues even after the initial kind of warfare situation that establishes the relationships in a given society. That war remains constant. The roles women play fall into that, and subordinate women are usually drawn to dominant men because of their status and position, so on and so forth. And so this is the framework for subordinate male target hypothesis, where you're looking at an actively ongoing set of practices in a given society that continue to target subordinate males long after the fact. And so this flies in the face of intersectionality, because intersectionality holds to the position that Black women were the most oppressed, because whether you're talking about race, sex, class, and gender, Black women were supposed to be at the bottom. One of the things that you find interesting, though, is when you really start to look at intersectionality and you start to look at the Black feminists that are making these arguments. If you look to Thina Mutwa, for example, who identified herself as a Black feminist, when she started to really examine this question of intersectionality, what she found was when she examined it empirically, it didn't hold. Because if Black men, simply men because we have penises, are supposed to be privileged, why is it we were going to jail more? Why is it that there's more police violence, police assault, police homicide? Why are these things happening to a greater extent to men than women if men have privilege, if Black men have privilege? So this argument that Black men are privileged because they're men, like intersectionality suggests that we are as oppressed as Black women in every way except gender, because by gender we profit, we benefit, we're privileged. But we find that actually Black men are targeted more by the society and to experience more harsh circumstances, right, on the basis of our race and gender. So
Yeah, big game
it's
hunting. You talk
contradictory.
about that.
Go ahead. What?
Yeah, you talk about that big game hunting in terms of black men
Yes.
being able to destroy a black man, incarcerate a black man.
Yes.
We could even argue harm a black man financially, get him fired. It's considered big game,
Yes.
right? Where, and matter of fact, I think the movie was it Menace to Society, where Charles Dutton or Sutton's role. He says there's a hunt going on, and you are the prey.
Yes.
Right.
One of the most powerful scenes. Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely. And you're dead on. Absolutely. Big game hunting is a clear example of that. And you can see it happening, again, going back to the subordinate male target hypothesis, you can see it happening with white men and white women. With white men, it's most easily characterized by, say, the police, right? And the role they play in big game hunting black men. With white women, it's a little more subtle. You can see it in terms of how the teacher will grade you. Like, you know, I've talked about my son, even though he's 19 now. When I finally put him into kindergarten, he had a white teacher. Within 2 weeks, she was trying to put him into special ed.
Oh, same thing with my son. My son is 17. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. And I didn't let her. Now, the difference between me and a lot of other black parents is that I had a lot more time as a professor and a single father. You know, so I just had time that other black parents couldn't. So I could just walk up and sit in class all day. In many instances, I only taught 2 days a week. So I had, 3 days of the work week where I could just show up. Other black parents couldn't do that. That said, I made him stay in those classes, and I've watched all the other kids performing the same kind of way, and we see data on this where teachers are drawn more to black boy behavior, even though the other kids are doing the same things, or in some instances, black boys are being punished and they haven't done anything.
Right.
Even while other kids are doing something, and black boys still find themselves punished. So there is that. But what I'm saying is, this is the same kid who's reading 700-page Harry Potter books within the next year, and these teachers are saying he needs to be in special ed. It did, but these are the kind of experiences. So when you think about a white woman teacher or a nurse, for example, there have been plenty of black men who have talked about going into the hospitals, going to the ER in pain, and having white women nurses, most particularly. And it's not limited to nurses. We see it with doctors too, but especially nurses in terms of white women, not actually giving them pain meds, not giving them pain meds that are required for the level of pain they're experiencing, or just mistreating them on in general, simply because they're in a position of power over a vulnerable black male who's in trouble. These are the kind of things that we experience that go back to what you said about earlier about big game hunting, right? And they speak to those experiences.
Absolutely. So we're going to now shift towards the black masculinist tone. But real quick, family, if you're watching, make sure you're subscribe and hit the like button as well. You're watching Lumumba Speaks here live on YouTube with Dr. T. Hasan Johnson, of course, the author of Solutions for Anti-Black Misandry, Flat Blackness, and Black Male Death. And we're discussing here on, of course, Lumumba Speaks and Beacon Network, the Pan-African social media extraordinaire. We're deconstructing anti-Black misandry, Flat Blackness in the 2024 election. We would get to 24 election, particularly in issues of public policy. But the black masculinist turn, you discussed it in 3 ways: the pre-turn, micro-turn, and the macro-turn. First off, what is the black masculinist turn?
Well, I frame that as a moment where, for black men, there's this clear indication that things are not the way you thought they were. As a matter of fact, when you're in an environment where things are actually working against you that you may not have seen that way, that's where you have this kind of turn. So I think the examples I usually give might be Ice Cube when he was on the show Cocktails with Queens, and he was talking to Vivica Fox and a few others. I think there's 3 other ladies, and they were having a conversation. And Ice Cube at that time, this was a couple years ago, where he was talking about the policies he was trying to put forth to the Democrats and the Republicans, on behalf of Black America. Now, we all know at that time he was chastised for being willing to sit down with Trump, but his position, and he was labeled as a Trump supporter, and he was saying, no, he said, I'm willing to sit down with either party. The Republicans were the ones that called me back. The Democrats just kind of put him off. That was what it was, but they framed him as somebody who was trying to actively work with Republicans. He said, I don't care who I'm working with as long as they're willing to engage our political interests. So when he goes on to the show, The Cocktails with Queens, he starts pointing out, what he's trying to do with this, this program that he has. And so the women, one of them in particular, the host, I guess, she points out to him, well, there's nothing in here for women.
Right. For
and he
Black
said, well,
women, yes.
Yeah, because it's a black agenda for Black America. And he's saying, well, there is something in there for women. You're Black, aren't you? And they said, no. And they had this big outcry. No, it needs to be something specific for Black women. What a lot of people overlooked is he didn't put anything in there for Black males either.
Right.
Coming at this as a Black masculinist, I didn't see anything in there consistent, particularly targeted for Black males. He was targeting it for the Black community in a generic fashion, but the women were requiring something very specific for them, going back to this intersectionalist idea that their oppression is greater and more compounded, and then that the men are still fundamentally privileged in a particular way where they don't understand the needs of Black women. But as a Black masculinist turn, that moment for many brothers was like, wow. So, you have this brother who's using his celebrity to advance something that might benefit the Black community, and it's being attacked if it doesn't have set-asides directly targeted only for Black women, even though he doesn't say anything about Black males in it either, right? So that I call it a Black masculinist term because of how many black men in that moment were shocked, and it became clear to them that this Black feminist idea has become so rampant and so normalized in the Black community that they didn't realize how far it had gone.
Yes.
You know what I mean? So that's why I call that's what I call a Black masculinist turn, a given moment like that.
One of the things you discuss in the pre-turn, of course, the pre-turn you define as moments of reflection or phenomena that go back decades that refer to historical situations and occurrences shaping social dynamics regarding Black men. You mentioned the movie Waiting to Exhale. Could you expound on how the movie Waiting to Exhale is reflective of the Black masculinist turn?
Oh man, you done caught me off. I forgot what I said about it.
So I can tell you. I can tell you. So you mentioned in the book Waiting to Exhale, of course, written by Terry McMillan, starring Angela Bassett, Tay Diggs. I remember I was 15 when the movie came out, 14, 15 years old. And of course, this was this issue. I mean, Angela Bassett's character, she's a corporate lawyer. She's doing well. She's living in Texas.
How Stella got her groove back?
Yes, I'm sorry. How Stella got her groove back. I'm sorry, not Waiting to Exhale. How Stella got her groove back. Yes.
Okay.
And and what happens is this basically was Passport Sisters, right? But it wasn't demonized until Black men engaged in the same behavior nearly 2 decades later.
Oh man, you're dead on, because actually there were books out at that time in the 90s about Black women going to Jamaica, and I have family members that did that, looking for men, going on their own sexual escapades. Nobody said a word. Black men in particular, most particularly, Black men didn't say anything about it. Terry McMillan herself, who wrote How Stella Got Her Groove Back, engaged in it, right? She came back, brought a young man back from Jamaica that she married. Turns out the brother ended up, being gay.
Yes.
That became a whole issue unto itself. And there's some embarrassing interviews. Yeah, it was on Oprah. There was some embarrassing interviews where, there's a little TMI brought forward. But at the end of the day, what her and others like her were arguing at that time was that Black men here were trifling. First of all, there weren't enough of us that fit the status that they were looking for. But fundamentally, Black men here are flawed. So go find them in other countries. And so they were using Jamaica as one of those kind of places. And there's a lot of gender dynamics to that we could talk about as to why it doesn't work. But the point you raised is significant. They were writing books about it. They were talking about this as being some kind of mass solution for Black women, and Black men didn't say anything. Society didn't say anything. It's not until about 4 or 5 years ago where Black men really started talking about doing, and mind you, they weren't telling society we're going to other countries because we don't like Black women. They were telling each other.
Right. And
others came into those discussions and, made it accessible to the mainstream in that way. But Black men were talking to each other saying, look, if you're tired of dealing with the same issues, there are women in other countries that would see you as a valued person to be with. Right. That said, that difference in how that's interpreted could be viewed as a Black masculinist turn. In one vein, when Black women did it, it wasn't a problem. They didn't have a problem with it. The ethics of it were fine. But when Black men did it, all of a sudden it was unethical. Now Black men were being called pedophiles. They were becoming, all these kind of
colonizers. One of them was colonizers.
Yes, colonizers. But it wasn't, it wasn't a problem when they did it, right? And they had books about it. So this was not just something that a couple of people did. This was an idea that was being floated. And if you saw How Stella Got Her Groove Back, they were proposing this to Black women as a solution. Go get you a
Absolutely.
young boy in another country and so on and so forth.
Absolutely.
So, that, yeah. One of the biggest pre-turns for me, however, was Eddie Murphy Raw.
Yes, you mentioned that. Yes.
And when Eddie Murphy talked about Johnny Carson getting divorced, and I think it was like, I think he lost like 100, 200 million to his wife or something like that. It was a crazy amount. And Eddie was like, she ain't told her a joke. You know what I mean? He, although it may have been Richard Pryor who said something similar about another situation prior to that. But anyway, the point being is Eddie Murphy laid that out. And for Black men, because at that time we didn't have social media. So you didn't have a space, a free space that all you needed was a phone or a laptop or a computer to access. At that time, for the Black male experience, for us to even reflect on it, you were in barbershops, you were having one-on-one conversations at best. And outside of that, even though women had talk shows, movies, television shows, you had to wait for either a comedian or a rapper to say something that affected you. And you kind of had to filter your desire to hear that coming through somebody, in these choice moments where a rapper or comedian would say something. So when Eddie Murphy brings this up and he talks about divorce and women getting half, even though they didn't have to do anything to contribute to building that wealth, and the unfairness of that, for men, it was like, yeah, you know what I mean? But there were so few public spaces you heard that it was just revolutionary to hear. It smacked you in the face like, yeah, how has this become normalized? But the unfairness of it is overlooked. So I call that an example of a pre-turn. Something that happened a couple of decades ago.
Now, this is something I'm going back. Of course, I'm 41, so I was born in '83. I think of the movie that came out when I was about 9 or 10, Mrs. Doubtfire. Well, of course, this wasn't about Black men, but the woman wants a divorce. He has to leave the home, and she denies him access to his children using the court to weaponizing the court, right? Based on the fact that he was an actor, he didn't have consistent employment. Richard Gere is the boyfriend. Now he has access to the children. Right. And who knows what he's going to be about. Right. And we know bringing men into the home is the number one cause of children being victims of sexual abuse. And then he has to dress up as his nanny, right, to be able to have actual quality time with his children. And the children find out and keep up the rules. And then when he goes to court and makes his heartfelt and passionate speech about why he did what he did, because he loves his children, wants to spend time with them, the judge dismisses him as, oh, you're an actor. That was all an act. That was a performance. You're not seeing the kids. You get 2 hours of supervised visits a week.
Right.
Case closed. And then at the end of the movie, I remember correctly, it's been some 30 years since I watched it. The mother says, you know what? No, you do love your children. You have access to them. But once again, his access to his children was based on the largesse of the mother.
Oh, yeah.
It wasn't because he actually had any agency in the situation.
No, he didn't. He had to depend on her good graces.
Right.
There's the argument they have at the end. After the court case, after the judge's decision, she shows up at his job and they end up having this real interesting argument. And he says, you sat there and listened to that judge say those things about me and you didn't say anything.
Right. And you know they aren't true.
And now he's having supervised visits like he's some kind of monster. And that was never something that, was ever an issue. It would be one thing if her kids had experienced something, she had questions, they found out that he had been violating his kids. That's one thing. But that was never an issue. So he was saying how offended he was that not only did she allow that to happen, that discussion to happen, but it actually manifested itself in how the divorce was framed. And the only way he could see his kids was under a certain type of supervision. He was so thoroughly offended. But I think what frustrated a lot of men about that movie and those kind of scenes is you had to, as a man, you were subject to her whim, as you said. You were subject to what she determined you should experience. And this is why when I talked about the gynocracy and I went through the bullet points, I had to bring up family court because this has a dramatic impact on the family itself. And it's become so normalized that I grew up in a family full of women. I remember hearing grandmother age women, aunties, grandmothers, mothers talking to young girls about what they can do when they get married to their husbands if they are dissatisfied with him, upset with him. These are the repercussions that she can lay at his feet. And I remember thinking, this is strange, but I didn't have a frame of reference to deal with it as a young boy. So I'm just listening, but I'm watching this intergenerational exchange of how you can use the state on your behalf to control and influence his behavior And nobody found that to be a problem whatsoever.
Right.
Now, men didn't like it, but half the time, if it had happened to your father, you don't get to see him and talk about it anyway. Right. And by the time you do, you see things from the vantage point of your mother because that's who you're socialized with. But the dynamics of that, again, policy-based, state-supported, influences how women of each generation are interacting with the state on their own behalf, on their whim, and how that adversely affects men. These issues in and of itself have a dramatic impact on Black family formation, and they still do. They still do. If anything, it's still ramping up.
Absolutely. Micro term, you talk about small scale events. Black therapists, you talk about Black therapists speaking out, speaking negatively about Black men on TikTok. You talk about divestors briefly, and then of course this concept of Black male inferiority.
Well, when you're dealing with micro turns, you have that. That was especially a couple of years ago. You saw a lot of that on TikTok, on Twitter, where you had these Black female relationship counselors who were coming up talking about how monstrous Black men were, how completely emotionally immature Black men were. They weren't good partners. You had a series of them that became very, that went viral, talking about Black men, talking about how they weren't going to work with Black men anymore, so on and so forth. So those are definitely issues. But I'm also speaking to the situations where Black men are directly experiencing this. I remember when I was married, I'm a widower, but when I was married, there was a point where we went to a relationship counselor. And overwhelmingly, and this is happening with the field of psychology, something Richard Reeves has been talking about. The field of psychology is he said in the next 10 years will be over 98% female, right? So most of these therapists, relationship counselors, life coaches tend to be women, right? So you and your girl, your wife, or whatever are sitting in there, and men have been talking about this for decades. I remember men talking about this in the 80s. The feeling of sitting in an interview, sitting in a counseling session where these two women and yourself are there, and inevitably the conversation comes to what you are not doing right in the relationship, what you need to do more of. And very rarely have men experienced this critique being brought to their wife. As a matter of fact, it's only in the last couple of years that I've started to see therapists and counselors coming online on social media, women therapists saying, you know what? I heard men say that women don't get critiqued. So I started to critique women in these sessions, and I was surprised to find that the women stopped coming.
Yeah.
The women stopped coming. They didn't want the critique. They didn't like it. It didn't make them feel good. In essence, they were coming to relationship counselors to browbeat their husbands, boyfriends into acting right. But when the criticism came to them, they didn't want to come anymore.
Yes.
Right. And so you have these experiences going on where the field in and of itself, when it comes to both psychology and then therapy and counseling, and especially relationship counseling, all these sub areas, is heavily influenced by this kind of gynocentrism. It's centered in women's experiences, and it prioritizes their feelings and worldviews in ways that men are just supposed to take. And if you draw criticism about it, you're a misogynist, you're a sexist, so on and so forth. Right. So the problems that come about with that. So yeah, the microturns speak to a number of different levels of these moments where men are starting to reflect on, damn, this is not right. This is a problem. But we often don't have a language for it, which is why I'm trying to give it one, because we've been experiencing. I can sit down with my grandfather and he can identify with these experiences. He just didn't have a language for it then either.
Right. And you talk about divestors briefly. So we saw typically in the Black community, when Black men engage in relationships with non-Black women, particularly white women, they're seen as cornballs, sellouts, so on and so forth. But when Black women engage in the behavior, it's actually praised, it's pedestalized, it's you go girl, so on and so forth. So we see once again, and I would argue just a level of inherent hypocrisy.
Oh yeah.
Right, in terms of if you're coming from a race-first dynamic, right, in terms of Pan-Africanism, this concept of Garveyism manifesting in the 21st century, but yet when you engage in behavior that would be antithetical to the concepts of radical Pan-Africanism, right, it's praised because of who you're doing it with. But when a Black man does the same, he's shamed, he's castigated, he's browbeat. You're the reason why the Black community isn't where it is. And you're the matter of fact, you're the reason why we were violated during the Holocaust of enslavement. We even saw that with the actress Monique.
Yeah.
Right. So Yeah, we're really talking. I mean, we're really getting into the macro term. This concept of brazen misandry. I could think of a sister. I wouldn't. I'm using the term sister lightly, where she actually called for androcide, the killing of male babies or the
Mhm.
deleting of male babies while they're in the womb. That she was invited on Cocktails with Queens.
Well, yeah, and she had a sizable channel on YouTube, and I think it's
Yes.
only been in a few. It might have been earlier this year where she was finally pushed off YouTube. And the irony there is, it wasn't black men or men that got her off YouTube. It was a white woman
Mm.
that listened to a random show and took offense and responded to YouTube, and she was taken down. So men have been complaining for the
Yeah.
longest about some of these misandrist content creators, to no avail. And matter of fact, women have gotten black men's channels taken down repeatedly over the last 6-7 years. But it's been difficult the other way when there are clear examples of just an inhumane misandry. But it
Yes.
took a white woman to write one letter to YouTube, and she was taken down. But the point being, you're right. She was talking about androcide in terms of the killing of male children. It's absolutely ridiculous. But this is part of the gynocentrism we're talking about. There's a larger gynocentrism in society where certain things women can do is acceptable. Like, for example, women can falsely accuse a man or a celebrity
Right.
of something he
Brian
didn't
Banks.
do.
You talk about Brian Banks.
Absolutely. I'm about to show that in my class next week, as a matter of fact. Right. Women can do these kind of things, and you're lucky if you see her name in the newspaper article about it. You
Right.
damn sure don't see her face. You often don't see her name. And even if she's proven to have lied about it beyond the shadow of a doubt, like in terms of what happened with what's the singer? Chris Brown.
Yes.
Last time,
that, yes.
a year or two ago, he was accused of sexually violating somebody. He had proof that he hadn't done it. He had texts from her. Her lawyers dropped her like a hot potato, but her name wasn't made public. Her face wasn't made public. She wasn't jailed for falsely accusing him. And this becomes normalized, right?
Right.
One, we know that men can't really do this. Men can't falsely accuse women of some type of sexual violation and be taken seriously. But two, women can do it, and then they don't even suffer from a reputation, issue.
Johnny Depp, ex-girlfriend.
Johnny Depp, yeah.
Right. Most men, if they were exposed, they would lose their job. She still was able to be in Aquaman too.
That was a macro turn in and of itself with Johnny Depp, because Johnny got it on tape.
Yes.
Johnny recorded her saying, "Nobody's gonna believe you." And this is why it had impact on black men, Latinos, because as a white man, this case is going to get international attention, and as a white celebrity, and it did. But the most critical part of that dynamic was he recorded her saying it. So in other words, society as a whole did not believe men. And you still hear this when men say false accusations happen all the time. Society says no, it only happens less than 1% of the time. And really, they're just talking about the cases that were found.
Right.
But at the end of the day, men are discounted. But when that happened and Johnny Depp actually was able to provide evidence, it shocked everybody. Absolutely. It was the Rodney King of false sexual assault accusations, because he got her on tape.
Absolutely. And I would even, Ezekiel Elliott, of course, being here in Ohio, a huge Ohio State fan, Ezekiel Elliott, when he was going to leave to go to the NFL, there was a white young lady that he was seeing. He broke up with her, and she called the police and told her girlfriend, tell the police. She sent the text message saying, tell the police that he hit me. Now, the girlfriend, her girlfriend was afraid to lie to the police and actually told them the truth and showed them the text message, where she asked them to lie. And the NFL still retroactively said, well, even though you weren't in the NFL at the time, this issue arose 3 years before 3 years ago, so we're going to suspend you for the rest of the season. Absolutely ridiculous.
Well, what kind of worldview is that going to produce in a demographic, in a society of women who know they have the power to accuse with no repercussion? They're not even going to get a slap on the hand for the most part. They know they can do this to anybody. I don't care if you're a teacher. I don't care if you're an elected official. I don't care if you're just a guy walking down the street. Any woman at any time can do this and be taken far more seriously than not.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? And especially, and we've seen this with college students, where it'll be two people. Like, there was a case, I think, in Southern California, where two college students got drunk and had sex, and she accused him of violating her because she was drunk. She couldn't provide consent. But he made the argument when he
neither one of us were able to provide.
We were both drunk. I didn't technically have the ability to consent either, but the society didn't see it that way. They saw it as her. And the other problem is, when it happens on a college campus, often the campus won't include law enforcement in a formal manner. they'll
Right.
put together their own tribunal and they'll judge the situation internally. So you have a lot of young men who were put out of school and ended up having to take their cases to court and actually win in a court of law, but they were kicked out of school
Right.
at the time it
Yeah.
happened under dubious circumstances due to an accusation with very little merit and no evidence, and that
Absolutely.
sufficed.
Yeah.
And if he didn't have the means to sue, like many black men don't, what happens to him?
Right. There was a football player for the University of Wisconsin that happened to him. He was able to get back in school, back on the football team. He sued the university because he was able to provide evidence after the fact that the woman had lied. Right. So this is something that does take place. I even worked as student conduct at a large public institution. And so I saw what you were referring to.
Mm-hmm.
So now we're going to move toward anti-Black misandry. Once again, family, if you're watching Lumumba Speaks, the Black Empowerment Initiative, where we believe we could gain a competitive advantage by always betting on Black. And of course, Bequaline Network, the Pan-African social media extraordinaire, the home of African-centered news and information. And we're having a riveting conversation with Dr. T. Hasan Johnson, where we're deconstructing anti-Black misandry, flat Blackness in the 2024 election. What is anti-Black misandry?
Well, to quote directly from Tommy Curry, his definition is the cumulative assertions of Black male inferiority due to errant psychologies of lack, dispositions of deviance, or hyperpersonality traits, e.g., hypersexuality, hypermasculinity, which rationalize the criminalization, phobics, and sanctioning of Black male life. These ideas are part of the group-based racial consciousness of white America and part of the social fabric and mythology of racism. So you're talking about a very specific type of racism that is as much raced as it is gendered, but it is directed at Black males in a very unique way that many overlook. Because when we think about, especially in the Black community, when we think about how racism is gendered, we've only been trained with an intersectionalist lens. Right. So we only see it in terms of how it affects Black women and by extension, maybe Black LGBT. But the assumption is that straight Black men, this is not something that they really experience, and therefore, it's not real. And I've even had people tell me, misandry is just something you're making up. You're just making that up. Despite how much empirical evidence we can bring to bear, that's still irrelevant, right? So, but that's what we're dealing with a form of structured and structural racism that is gendered and raced, particularly in relation to Black males.
Right. And so you make the argument in your text that in your book, that anti-Black misandry manifests in 13 key ways. And you talk about these stereotypes about Black men that, of course, for many were created during the Holocaust of enslavement, but even modern times, such as the 70s and the 90s, in terms of the buck, the brute, the mandingo, Sambo, Uncle Tom, Zip Coon, the noble savage, and then, of course, lately, the pimp and the gangster, right? So, and you talk about those 13 key ways. We are going to go through all of them. But you talk about heterophobia and bell hooks. And so if I could just very quickly, I'll talk about my experience in the academy with heterophobia. It started off first month in my doctoral program, large public university. And I'm happy to be a doctoral student. I'm happy to be there. We have a meeting regarding gender with the first and second year cohorts. And a young lady gets up and says, I don't feel comfortable around Bakari because he's very masculine.
Yep.
And I said, okay, well, this is news to me. And one of the professors said, well, Bakari, what I think you should do is you should change who you are when you walk into a room to allow other people to feel comfortable with your presence. And I said, Doc, I can't do that. I said, for a couple of reasons. I said, one, I wouldn't advise my children to engage that way. I said, two, I said, I'm not a character from Spider-Man, the animated series. I'm not the chameleon. If I did engage that way, I wouldn't have an identity. And I said, number three, it sounds like this is discrimination based on sex and or gender.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. And I said, number four, I said, this is in 1910. I'm not going to walk off the sidewalk when you come walking down the street. And I'm not going to bow my head and not look you in your eyes when you speak. I said, those days are over with.
Yes.
So these are real issues that Black men experience. And you talk about how this typically manifests in the academy.
Yes. In the academy, in the larger society. I mean, when you think about the statistical difference between how the police treat Black men and even Black women. I mean,
Right.
of course, there are situations where Black women are assaulted and or even killed by police officers, but statistically, it's nowhere near what
Right.
happens with Black men, right? That would be an example of anti-Black misandry on a structural level, right? In the sense that
Right.
where you have the police who are engaging this. We didn't even talk about what happens to Black men and women in court in terms of how we're sentenced. We know just on gender terms that men get what about 63% longer sentences for the same crimes that women commit.
Right.
So on a structural level, there's a gender issue there, and it's exacerbated by race because white men get longer time than white women for committing the same crime, but Black men will get even longer periods of time in their sentence because we're Black and we're male. So when you talk about structural anti-Black misandry, this is not something that just happens because you have a teacher that's terrified of Black men. This is something that's built into the fabric of society, where from the police to the court to the treatment in prison, as just an example in terms of the carceral situation, you see these things built in for Black men in a very
Right.
particular way. So when we talk about anti-Black misandry, it's just not somebody that had a bad experience with a man and now questions all men and she's scared of all men. There's a level of that we can talk about, but we're talking about how it's built into the very fabric of society. I show a video in my class. It's a skit that two men put together. It's a white dude and a Black brother. And the skit is that the white dude, it's a very public place, but he tries to rob. He tries to steal a car.
Mm.
So he has the device where you kind of you slip it down the window and you try to
Right.
unlock the door from the outside. So he's around a crowd of people in a public area in front of stores and whatnot on the side of a street, and he's there for 10 minutes trying to unlock this car, and nobody looks at him once. Cop cars drive by, nobody's concerned. Well, the second part of the skit, the Black guy does the same thing. He doesn't get 60 seconds into it before a police officer drives up, gets out the car, and pulls a gun on him.
Mm.
Right. So when we talk about anti-Black misandry, another example of how that works, right? It's in the psychology as well as in the practice of policy. Well, go ahead.
Understood. Understood. I would agree 100%. Heterophobia and bell hooks. You have a vociferous critique of bell hooks.
Yeah, well, as far as bell hooks is concerned, I think she's become one of the saints in Black feminist discourse. For many Black male studies scholars, there's a lot of questions because she didn't really cite a lot of her work. So people tend to treat her positions as gospel, even if it contradicts the data or isn't backed by anything. And that in and of itself is kind of a problem that I think needs to be reexamined. But heterophobia in and of itself, is obviously, a fear of Black men. And so one of the ways I teach this in class, I ask for, examples of heterophobia. And of course, people who are unfamiliar with the term don't know where to necessarily go with it. But I said one of the clearest examples of it is lynching.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at lynching, especially from the 19th and the early to mid 20th century, a good portion of the lynching of Black men was sexual in its dynamic, right? There was always this kind of threat, most particularly to white women's sexual purity. And so, many of the lynchings that took place were at the accusation that a Black man had done something to a white woman. And the lynchings themselves would almost always involve doing something to Black male genitalia,
Right.
violating, the anus, things of that nature. They were sexual in nature as well. So not only the accusation sexual in nature, the punishment, right? The lynching itself was sexual in nature. Well, when we're talking about heterophobia, it's not to say that every Black man lynched was straight and that there were no gay men involved in that, but it is to say that the crime is conceptualized as a heterosexual crime.
Right.
It is the Black man violating a white woman and a Black man being lynched because of that, assumed violation, right? That violation in and of itself is heterosexually framed. And so when we talk about a fear of straight Black men, lynching is one of the clearest examples of that. And usually when I tell that to brothers who are in Africana studies or whatnot, the moment and I've done this even at conferences, I've said, okay, heterophobia, and brothers will be like, okay, what's an example? And I'll just have to say lynching. And for those brothers who are aware of that history, they go, oh, and they immediately know what I'm talking about.
Absolutely.
Because those crimes are so sexually framed, there's not a lot of room for anybody and everybody being accused. It's particularly heterosexual Black men.
Absolutely. I can even think of Monster Cody in his book, The Autobiography of L.A. Gangman. But I think you're from California, yes?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Well,
And he
raised in
talked about
Cali.
how when they were at YA, and he talked about the linebacker size COs would brutalize them and stomp on their testicles.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. So we see once again that this concept of heterophobia. And of course, Bell Hooks, I've read a lot of literature. I've even read her literature where a lot of the concepts she has of Black men, not only you could argue are ahistorical, particularly arguing that Black women were more oppressed under Black male patriarchy in Africa rather than colonialism, which is just ahistorical. Like, so, but once again, it's accepted as a gospel truth, even though she likes to play slick and loose with the facts.
Exactly.
I think you've talked about Dr. Tommy J. Curry talked about Bell Hooks and her concept of Black men as being domestic abusers post-slavery, right? So now we're bringing in, of course, this color purple concept. However, when we actually was able to, dig, do a deeper dive, we found that she was actually citing a white pro-slavery ethnologist that was arguing that Black people should stay enslaved because if they didn't, Black men would be abusing Black women. So, we have to consider the source as well. And being a PhD, that first thing you look at when you receive an article or document, you look at, of course, the references section. Who are you citing? Where are you getting your information? So, something to consider. Male feminization. You talk about, once again, male feminization is a aspect of anti-Black misandry. How so?
Hold on. Let me see. You got me up in here heavy. I appreciate it. I haven't talked about.
I told you, listen, brother. I'm gonna hold you down. I'm gonna hold you down. So in your book, this is actually on page.
I'm on the page. Yeah,
page 48.
The fear of Black men's sexuality in society is rooted in a seemingly contradictory conceptualization of Black manhood by white society as a dysfunctional male, read feminine or inferior counterpart to white masculine sexual norms. Thus, regardless of sexuality, Black men were considered effeminate, dependent, hypersexual, and sexually violent. This is the legacy of 19th century to 20th century ethnologists and their inhumane worldview of Black men. And this is something Dr. Curry talks about in The Man Not, right? Where the family, the plantation family, the way it's conceptualized, Black folk were treated like, first of all, they were treated like cattle more than anything else. We weren't technically viewed as men or women per se, but theoretically, to the extent that we were conceptualized as children of the family, children of the white family, most particularly the white patriarch and the white mistress, right? We were conceptualized as children in that way, and our sexuality was conceptualized as other. It was as problematic and things of that nature. So that's what that kind of had to deal with in terms of the not only the effeminization, but also the kind of paternalistic approach to Black sexuality and Black people in general as being almost childlike. We're conceptualized as being childlike in that way. So I think that's where we kind of go. Did we lose you?
No, I'm here.
Okay.
Yes, I would agree wholeheartedly. I think that's a great point that you're making. We're going to touch on that as well. So,
but it also deals with queerness, right?
Yes.
I talk about that in there as well. Black male feminization is the hallmark of Black queerness in popular consciousness, as lesbianism is slightly more acceptable in Western culture, mainly because of its eroticism for many men, particularly white men. The reason, in that respect, the way black queerness is kind of framed is even more otherized than white queerness, and it comes out of a very particular sexual history of how Black folk were seen in the 19th century, most particularly. So I think that's where I was going at there.
Absolutely. Family, and if you haven't, you got to get the book. You have to get the book, Solutions for Anti-Black Misandry, Blackness, and Black Male Death, the Black Masculinist Turn by Dr. T. Hasan Johnson. I would argue this book, this read is a godsend. If you're interested in, of course, in improving your lives as Black men, if you're interested, of course, in improving the lives of some of your Black male friends or even family members, definitely make sure that you purchased the book. And I will put the link once again in the chat to the book. So,
well, one thing I appreciate you for, man, is usually when people talk to me about it, they haven't gotten past the introduction. So that's where the conversation generally stays. So I think you're probably the first person to interview me about the book that actually read through the book.
Yes, sir.
I appreciate that.
No problem. No problem. I mean, as you can see behind me, I'm a bibliophile. So,
right.
So it's something I love to do. It's a love of learning, a lifelong love of learning that I've had. But once again, as I stated, in just kind of the foreground of this conversation, I may have shared this with you offline, but not online. And you could share this with the audience, that I was told by brothers who had their doctorates, had their PhDs, before I started my doctoral program, that I was going to encounter anti-Black misandry. I said, first off, what the French social are you talking about? I've never even heard of the term. And I said, listen, I'm going to an institution that I'm not going to have those problems. 1 month into the program, I was calling those brothers, hey, do you have a moment to talk? So these are real issues that Black men face on a daily basis, not only in the academy, but just in civil society as well.
Well, I'll say this: in the last 5 to 6 years since I started my YouTube channel, I can't tell you how many dissertations that I sat on in terms of being officially invited and serving on these brothers' committee, mainly to protect them. Because much of the time, many, if they're dealing with race and gender, for the most part, they tended to have Black feminist-led committees on their dissertations. And some of them received outright threats that if they cited Tommy Curry or myself, or if they decide to deal with Black male studies, or if they even decided to deal with a Black male subject for their dissertation, that they would not pass, they would not finish, and they would end up having to just drop out. I mean, these are direct threats being made. So I've been invited and sat on so many different committees just to provide them ideological protection so that they could get through, to validate the arguments made on behalf of Black men and be able to argue that at the committee level. And much of the time I didn't have to do much once I was there, but as long as there was no representation, these brothers were being bullied. It was
going to be a problem. Absolutely.
It was going to be a problem. Yeah.
If I don't mean to cut you off, just very quickly, because where I started my program is not where I finished. I actually transferred to another institution. At the previous program, I received very strong pushback. We just put it politely, strong pushback based on the fact that I was critiquing intersectionality.
Yes, absolutely.
It was an issue. So they were like, "What are you doing here?" Yes. And I said, I have a strong personality. I said, "Are the claims I'm making factual?" I said, "That's all that matters. Is this not conjecture? This is not innuendo? Are the claims that I'm making factual?"
Right.
Well, I said, you know what, you right. I said, you the doctor already. I'm not. You got it. Right. My bad.
Well, and that was one of the reasons I had to provide that kind of protection. But here's the other. In the culture of the academy, and you know this, the idea is that once you finish, you are a reflection of your committee. Technically, they're supposed to advocate for you to get teaching positions. But if you come out with a position that's antithetical to theirs, you end up making them look bad that you even graduated, let alone made it through. So you have this culture of students being brought through that are supposed to be stamped and verified by their committees and then advocated for to be able to go forth into the academic community and extend the word of whatever position you were supposed to take. So many of the brothers that are coming through with Black male studies are filtering through all of these different fields with all of these different committees, and much of the time dealing with a great deal of hostility. And if they are able to make it through, now they have to go into the job market with very little support from their own committees. I mean, they may have a letter, but there's a difference between a committee member giving you a letter because you graduated with your doctorate and having a committee pick up the phone, or committee members pick up the phone and say, "Hey, come get my boy. This is my new student. He's graduating. He needs a job." Very different experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Phallophobia.
Phallophobia. The fear of the Black male phallus. And I give an example in there with Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, popular African feminist, and, some of the statements that she was making about trans folk.
Yes, I'm familiar. I watched the interview.
Yeah. So, in that, one of the things I was talking about is, and this is still something we see in when we talk about trans as an example, trans communities or whatever. really, when you talk about trans, most people think about, especially Black trans, right? Most people think about trans women, right? We think about biologically born males who
Right.
transition and become trans women. But we often don't think about, trans men in that respect, because for the most part, it's hard to tell them apart. Once you see, most trans men, many of them, especially if they've had surgery and have most particularly have gone on the hormones, they look like any other brother walking down the street. And many of them are experiencing that in terms of police brutality,
Excuse me.
police homicide. So when you talk about the treatment of trans men, say by police officers, most of the time when they're killed, for example, it's not because they're known to be trans. It's because they present as Black men.
Right. And you mentioned that, of course, in the text.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But I think when I was talking about phallophobia, at least one of the biggest examples I give when I speak on it is this whole question of bathrooms. And actually, by extension, we can also talk about incarceration, right? The idea being that, with trans women, especially those who have retained their penis, there's a fear of that phallus, right? That we don't talk about. So in other words, nobody's concerned that trans men are going into men's bathrooms. When's the last time you've heard somebody complain about that?
Right.
You got a trans man who looks like any other dude who's going into a men's bathroom and going into the stall. Has anybody raised any concerns about that whatsoever?
I can't cite any.
No. And ironically enough, I bet you money that if a concern was raised, it would be on how vulnerable the trans man may be if they still possess a vagina. Because who would be sexually threatened in that situation in terms of how people conceptualize a trans man in a male bathroom? It wouldn't be the men, right? There's no fear for men's well-being. The fear would be on behalf of this trans man who may still retain a vagina. The idea being, much of the conversation around that is really around trans women who still may possess a penis. When we started to talk about, when you heard a few years ago about this whole uproar about using bathrooms and whatnot, the fear was mainly about, and it's still happening, even in gyms, locker rooms, there's still this issue of trans women who still have a penis who are walking around women's spaces posing a sexual threat simply because they exist. Now, I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with that one way or the other. I'm merely pointing out that from a societal standpoint, we still find ways to problematize the phallus, even in a trans context. So when I talk about phallophobia, that's what I was talking about. I was saying, even in this trans context, where people are switching genders and getting surgeries and whatnot, the fear from society is still the fear of the phallus in any of those contexts. It still comes down to that. And that's happening in prisons now as well. You've seen some trans women who have been sent to women's prisons, and some of their cellmates are showing up pregnant.
Mm-hmm.
These are concerns on that level as well. Nobody's talking about trans men going to men's prisons. I don't even know if it's happening, but we definitely don't hear about it, do we?
No.
That's not the concern. The concern is who has the phallus and what danger do they pose to others. So so again, with biologically born men who transition to trans women, society is still very much afraid of the biologically male aspect of them. Right? So when we really start to delve into the deeper levels of anti-Black misandry, especially as it relates to this kind of trans context, it's interesting to see who is still feared and who isn't. Because I've not heard trans men brought up at all.
This is true. Very true. Disposability.
Mm-hmm.
You talk about disposability as a concept that refers to widely ignored Black male struggles, difficulties, and victimization.
Yeah. One of the earliest examples of that I remember using was Boko Haram.
Yes.
And, the first time I heard about Boko Haram, I saw Michelle Obama holding a sign saying, I think it was hashtag bring back our girls, because Boko Haram had allegedly kidnapped a number of young women. What I found mind-blowing about that is there was only one article that I found that actually said that before that incident had happened, I think it was up to about 50 Black boys, African boys, were burned alive in a school by Boko Haram. And there was no mention of it.
Correct.
So the girls were taken, and that, as it should be, was internationalized, and it was brought to the world's attention, and it was condemned. And again, as it should be. But nobody said a word about these boys who were burned alive. Nobody had anything to say about it. And I found that so frustrating, because at the end of the day, there was still a chance for these girls to be found and returned to their families, right? There was still a chance for them to have their lives redeemed. These boys had nothing, and nobody gave a damn. So when I talk about disposability, that's one example of how I'm framing that. The extent to which the experience of males can be downplayed and dismissed altogether. And keep in mind, when you're talking about groups like Boko Haram, even when they take boys, those boys are often threatened into serving in the group. Their families are threatened, their family's well-being is threatened, and thus you have to join the group and do what you're told, even if it means bringing harm to others, or your own families will be hurt if not killed. So there's still an experience with boys who are taken alive into groups like that. But again, the male experience of that is really kind of dismissed, and they're just perceived from the vantage point of this violent group. But the nuance of how these boys get recruited into these groups and what serves as motivation for them to serve in those groups gets swept under the rug.
Absolutely. And let me ask you this, because I've mentioned this on my platform a number of times and I just want to know from your professional opinion if this would fall under the concept of disposability. I've argued that nowadays when we look at it from a gynocentric frame of reference, like as you like to call it, a Black feminist patriarch frame of reference, fatherhood is considered fluid and fathers are fungible. So almost to the point where whoever the woman is in a relationship with, that's who the dad is. That's the father, right? Would you argue that would be another example of Black male disposability?
On a conceptual level, the very idea of the family where the father role is up for grabs, but the mother role is honored and placed in high esteem.
Yes,
absolutely. And we saw that with Black Lives Matter.
Yes, right? And I'm sorry, I skipped over that. Wanted to get your thoughts on Black Lives Matter, the organization. I know on page 9, and I'll just quote you very quickly. You argue, not page 9, I think it's page 6. I'm sorry. You talk about this concept, the proverbial you, as a Black man, has been contending with hatred and social disdain intra-communally for generations. And it finally becomes the most apparent when the most visible social protest organization in the last few decades profits from Black men's deaths while celebrating the idea of their very absence from Black families. This recognition of this disdain is the framework of this book, is the foundation of the Black masculinist turn.
And BLM was a Black masculinist turn in and of itself, but you're definitely right. I mean, basically, that was in response to something they've since taken down from their website, but was up for several years.
Yes, it was.
Was this idea of the reframing of the nuclear family. And the only difference between what they were proposing and the nuclear family as we understand it was the absence of fathers. And it goes back to what you just said a moment ago, that the idea, most particularly of the Black father, more so than any other father, was, fluid. Anybody could be the father. I mean, and we see this in a lot of different ways. I mean, every Father's Day, what do we see on social media?
I'm the mother and the father.
I'm the mother and the father. Yeah. I'm a single father. I've rarely heard a single father say I'm the mother and the father. Yes. And even if he does, it's not celebrated. It's not something that's posted up. But this is something we see particularly in the Black community. This celebration of the idea of how fluid Black fatherhood is, conceptually speaking. And the complete absence of Black fathers is totally acceptable, but there is no comparable measure of the absence of Black mothers and whether or not a man can be received well and celebrated for raising a child, even though the data actually shows us that even single fathers actually do raise kids much more successfully.
Yes, it does.
And single mothers and so on and so forth. But there's no celebration of that. You know what I mean? So, no, you're absolutely right. When it comes to whether or not the idea of whether or not that's another form, conceptually speaking, and I think it takes I think it's even more palpable when you talk about the role of that perspective in the academy. I mean, again, this is something we were talking about before the show. You and I read Black feminist works not only to be well-rounded scholars, but we really didn't have a choice. I mean, it was required reading. I mean, I took classes. I mean, up through my master's, I rarely took gender-based classes voluntarily because at that time, and maybe it's still the case, when you took a gender class, when you took a feminist gender class, especially in women's studies, you were going to end up in a class full of women, and at some point, everybody was going to wag their finger at you simply because you were a male. Nobody would ask you your experience. Nobody, because I had actually suffered as a child from having been sexually violated twice by a male and a female.
Sorry to hear that.
But none of that mattered when you sat in those classes because you represented man. You represented all men. Right? So most of us didn't take those classes whatsoever, but it didn't matter Because if you were taking a literature class, if you were a class that had nothing to overtly do with gender, you would still get some of these Black feminist teachers that would come in and they would bring that literature and those perspectives into the discussion, even though you didn't take a women's studies class, right? So this became required reading, regardless of whether or not you wanted to. Black male studies is not required reading. Now, many people will say, well, at one point in time, Black studies, all they did was they talked about the great men of history, right? Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and W.E.B. Du Bois, and therefore that was Black male studies. Actually, it wasn't. It was a very generic kind of approach to Blackness in a particular way, but it wasn't fixated on the inner workings of gender. It wasn't fixated on how gender dynamics played out. None of that was really being discussed. Feminism introduced the inner workings of gender, even though you had particular scholars that may have done some of that work, like Robert Staples and Du Bois, and there's many others that did, but there really wasn't a space for that until, feminists and women's studies as a field began to formalize this kind of gender discourse in a very particular way. And once that happened, part of what they introduced was this culture of avoiding and overlooking males as a gender group. So, for example, on a college campus, if somebody walked up to you and said, "Hey, doc, you should join us in this gender class we're taking." Well, if you hear gender class, what is it that most people would assume about it?
Women's studies.
Yeah, very few people. If you say a gender class, are they going to think, "Oh, you got a class about straight Black men, or even gay Black men?" That's never the assumption. The assumption is that gender is synonymous with female. But it's, and so you actually have, and this went on for several decades, you have an approach to gender that overlooked the fact that males had a gender. That's the interesting thing about it. So now you're starting to see women's studies department now, being reframed as women and gender studies. Now, I would still argue that doesn't generally include straight men's gender or approach to gender. It really is more of an umbrella term for LGBT in many respects. But the idea that even straight men have a gender that needs to be analyzed, studied, and understood is irrelevant at many a university, not just across the country, across the world. It's a very difficult time that you'll have finding a men's studies department. And the very few that you will find in America are overwhelmingly feminist in their orientation, so as not to offend or violate anybody's sensibilities. This is why Dr. Tommy Curry had to go to Ireland. Or was it Scotland? Excuse me.
Scotland, yes.
Yeah, he had to go to Scotland.
Edinburgh.
Yeah. In order for him to study African American men from a men's study standpoint, a Black male study standpoint, he had to go all the way to Scotland to do it, because you can't do it here. I had to create a Black male studies institute online, but finding one actually housed in a brick and mortar college, good luck.
That makes me think of, this is my second year of my doctoral program. And if you're watching, family, make sure you hit the subscribe and the like button. Make sure you hit the notification bell as well for updates to new videos. We're having a conversation on the Lumumba Speaks and Bequaline Network with the man, the myth, the legend, your favorite scholar's favorite scholar, Dr. T. Hasan Johnson, one of the preeminent voices in Black male studies. So I remember I was taking a class on the history of student activism in higher education. So it starts off, we learn about the Butter Rebellion, the Butter Protest at Harvard, 1600, something like that. The book we're reading talked about emotional labor in the workplace. First time I had heard the concept of emotional labor. Great, I'm learning new things. This is why I'm here. But the text states that only women suffered emotional labor in the workplace. I said, well, I would disagree with that, because I think anyone can experience emotional labor based on the demographic group that they're working with. So I mentioned, if you're LGBTQ, working with predominantly heterosexual people, if you're an immigrant working with American-born, if you're Muslim or atheist working with Christians, in any situation, you can experience emotional labor. One of the young ladies in the class said, "Nah, you just disagree because it's about women." I said, "Did you just hear what I said?" The professor, his response was, "Well, Black women suffer violence at the hands of Black men." I said, hold up, money. I said, one, that has nothing to do with what we're talking about. Two, that has no effect on me because I'm not a domestic abuser, right? So back to the conversation we're having. Then he says, well, you're controlling the conversation with your masculinity. I said, that Jedi mind trick doesn't work on me, right? I said, any person with a modicum of self-respect would take umbrage with you stereotyping a demographic group that they're part of as inherently violent and criminal in nature. So what are we doing here?
Yeah. Well, and if usually when they raise abuse, it's a deflection. But what we understand in Black male studies is that when it comes to intimate partner violence, especially in the Black community, the rates are bidirectional. So the moment he talks about, well, Black men abuse Black women, well, Black women abuse Black men. Right. Much of the time, when you look at the data, women actually initiate violence first.
Absolutely, I've experienced it in my life. I had a woman put her hands on me, then she said, "Hit me back." I said, "Nope, I'm calling the police."
Right. But at the end of the day, you could still go to jail, even if you have bruises on you and the police are called, and it's and she has none on her. But if she can say you hit her, you're the one going. And so again, there's the reality, there's the deflection and the mythology that we respond to. But no, that was a ridiculous exchange in terms of that. And going back to emotional labor, I developed the concept of male relationship emotional labor. And I tried to describe for men what how emotional labor can present itself in terms of the work that you do for others. Now, I talked about it earlier in terms of a kind of a general one where Black men are generally, especially if you're white collar and you're educated, you become very familiar, even as early as elementary school, because especially you're dealing with white women teachers, right? You learn very early how to make them feel better because of your presence, right? So you have all kind of different ways, even down to how you're dressed. You don't get to a doctorate and dress the way you are right now without understanding how to make other people feel at ease in your presence. That's one of the skill sets that nobody tells you as a Black male professional that you have to have, but you learn it very quickly. Because if you can't even have meetings with the professors in your grad school, and this happened to me, they wouldn't meet with me in person in their offices. They would only meet with me in public places. Why I would come to grad school just to steal your purse, I have no idea. But that was the perception. And even after I got a tenure track job, the deans wouldn't stand in the elevator with me, right? Unless there was someone else there. Would literally get out of the elevator, clutching their purses, thinking that I'm, you see what I mean?
Right. No, I can speak to that because I can recall when I was in my master's program, I had a young lady tell me, I thought you were a thug because you have muscles. I work out a lot, and you have muscles and you have a lot of tattoos. And I said, why would a thug come to college other on graduate school? That makes no sense.
None. When I first talked about male relationship emotional labor, the example that came to me was based off a movie I was watching, and so I kind of remembered it. So I mentioned to you earlier that I'm a widower, but one of the things that happened, my wife had sickle cell, so she was always sick, and every year she'd be in the hospital on the verge of life and death every year of her life, right? But I remember we lost altogether, we lost 3 pregnancies, right? And one of them got to about 6.5 months. So that said, after we lost that pregnancy, I remembered how far I used to go to make sure that she wasn't reminded. I'm not saying that it didn't pop into her head every 10 seconds because it was something she experienced, but I went out of my way to protect her from being reminded, right? So if we were taking a walk and I saw a woman pushing a baby cart, but she didn't see it, I'd turn us a different way. You know what I mean? We'd be sitting there watching TV. She'd go grab a drink and they'd say, "Oh, ER is coming on next. And it's about a woman who loses her baby in the ER." I would change the channel before she came back in. I was watching this movie and oh goodness, it's a Meryl Streep movie where she plays this white woman cook who goes to France to learn how to be a chef. The name of the movie escapes me right at this moment. But anyway, she's married and she couldn't have a child. And so there was a moment where she starts crying about it. And I started mouthing. I wasn't thinking. I was just talking as if this was my wife because my wife had done this. I started mouthing the things that I would say. Oh, I remember in the scene, she's reading a letter from her sister who's having a baby and she couldn't have one. So she starts to cry as she's reading the letter. And I started to say the things that I would say to my wife to offset it before it got too far. Because if it got too far, she was in bed for 3 days crying. Wouldn't be able to leave the house, none of that. as I was mouthing the words, I realized the husband in the movie was saying the exact same things I was. And I realized in that scene, he had become accustomed to rescuing her from the emotional pain she had from not being able to have a child. And I realized I had done the same. And I started to think about how many different ways I'd sought to do this to protect my wife's feelings and well-being moment to moment to moment. And as I reflected on it more and more, I realized this is not something special that I did. This is something men do all the time, Black men in particular, especially if you're raised in a gynocracy, meaning you're raised in an environment where women tend to hold sway in the family. You learn how to cater to them early as a child. I mean, even as a baby, you got to think about it. Your well-being is dependent on her body. Like you're literally getting your system from her. Right. So her moods, feelings, worldview, whatever it is, has a direct impact on your quality of life. So you learn as a young man, and as a young Black man, most particularly, how to cater to women's emotions, perspectives, worldviews, experiences. You learn how to do this very early. You learn it very early. And I realized in reflecting on that, that is a form of emotional labor that men, particularly Black men, are not credited for. Emotional labor is conceptualized as something only women do.
Yes.
And that was because it was part of at that time when the concept came about, it was during this, this rise of this feminist era where women were, really talking about their role in society and what they wanted to change and so on and so forth. It wasn't designed to actually account for what men actually experience as well, because that wasn't the political discussion they were having. So when I started to reflect on it, I realized there are a myriad of ways that men provide emotional labor, not only for women, but for children, but for even in the larger society, that men are generally not credited for, and Black men most particularly aren't credited for. So when we go back to son husbands and even husband sons, right? These men who are not as far along in life as the women they end up with, they still have to learn how to appease her emotionally, to navigate her feelings, to make her feel better about what's going on.
Walk on eggshells.
Yes. But walking on eggshells is a form of emotional labor. It makes her feel better. And then you find ways that where you can get her out of a mood and you can get her in a different mood, or you can uplift her, whatever it is. There's a million different ways this can present itself, but it's generally not something men are credited for knowing how to do, even though it takes a great deal of skill.
Absolutely.
I mean, think about even thinking about approaching a woman you don't know to get her phone number. Most people don't understand this unless you've had to do it. To learn how to approach a woman, they call it a cold approach. But how much skill does it take to walk up and strike up a conversation and make a woman laugh that you've never met before?
Right.
To say something that she's never heard before, to do something completely out of the box to get her attention, her phone number. Do you know how much skill is involved in that? And how many boys that I grew up with where we spent years practicing how to approach a stranger you've never met before. And this may be the only time you'll ever see her at a gas station, in a store. You got one chance to make an impression on a woman you've never seen before and do it in a way that's different from anything else she's ever seen. Do you know how much skill is involved in that?
Right.
Another form of emotional labor. But again, these are concepts that aren't generally attributed to men, so we ignore it. But in a weird kind of way, if you don't know how to do it, you're socially punished and you might find yourself without a woman.
Right.
It's an expected service that you're supposed to provide, but nobody tells you you're supposed to, and nobody tells you how to do it. But if you don't know how to do it, you will find yourself alone. So it's an interesting kind of dynamic.
Social incompetence. You talk about this concept of social incompetence. That's the 9th form of anti-Black misandry. The social incompetence, Black men are often seen as failed patriarchs or incompetent beings. They are considered almost childlike. So we see this going back to this cherubic type look, this cherubic type of disposition regarding Black men. We know is rooted, of course, in the Holocaust of enslavement. We can go beyond that. We can even argue even the Arab enslavement of African people promoted these types of concepts regarding Black men. You argue that it promotes this concept of Black men being managed by either white men or strong Black women. Could you provide some examples in, of course, popular culture?
Well, in essence, if you live in a society where your failure is a required, practice in order for society to function, this is kind of what we're talking about. Black male failure is how Black masculinity is framed. I mean, and it starts with something you mentioned earlier in the discussion about slavery. right? For us to have been forcibly brought to the Western Hemisphere, put to work on plantations, often to death, that, in and of itself, you're not going to be able to navigate and thrive in a society that's designed on your death, your labor, your failure in terms of being able to operate on par with the white men who've engaged this. I mean, it's predicated on that. It's predicated on you being able to be at the ground level of that society, because your labor and your sacrifice is what pushes the society on.
Absolutely.
But it's not designed for you to thrive in. You know what I mean? So for you to be able to for most Black men, you find that there are degrees of it. So one of the examples I give in class, I have a long set of clips that I've downloaded and I've showed this to. If you look at, say, sitcoms, right, and you look at some of the various characters, one of the ones I use a lot is Martin. If you ever watched the sitcom Martin,
yeah,
there's a martial arts teacher that he has in there.
Yeah,
who clearly doesn't know martial arts. He's
right. I know you're talking about. Yeah, he has on the red karate outfit. Absolutely,
the red outfit. His own students beat him up when
right.
when he owes them money. And so he's and you have the same thing with Hustle Man, who what's the brother's name? The comedian.
Hilarious. I know you're talking about though.
Hilarious comedian. His name escapes me right now. But my point in bringing up those two characters, if you ever go back and watch Martin, you watch Hustle Man, you watch the martial arts teacher, these are Black men that are ridiculed for being failures, being social failures. They're not navigating society.
Tracy Morgan is his name.
Tracy Morgan, thank you very much. I mean, Tracy Morgan's Hustle Man. He walks up and he just tries to sell you random stuff with crazy logic and whatnot. But
I'm trying to help you out, Chief.
Exactly.
How are you trying to help me out? Where you come from?
Exactly. And if you look at it, it's funny, but even the reasons why it's funny goes back to Black male failure, right?
The idea, it's almost comedic.
It's comedic.
The fact that Black men are unable to be successful. Yeah.
No, Black male failure is comedic to Black men and women, because our failure is part of how this system functions, and it's assumed in many ways. But think about that. Would it be as funny if a homeless woman walked up to a character and she hasn't eaten or anything, and she's the joke? She's the butt of the joke in the scene. Does that register as funny in the same kind of way?
No.
I think in that respect, when I'm talking about social failure, what I'm saying is that Black men's inability to navigate society like white men, a society that's designed to operate off of their sacrifice, that failure is almost a requirement in many ways. And so it's ridiculed, it's funny, it's dismissed, it's overlooked, it's taken for granted, and in many ways it's assumed to apply to Black men altogether. Thank you, LMA. Dragonfly Jones.
Yeah, Dragonfly Jones, absolutely. Yeah. And you talk about that concept, I think, of projection, how what one Black man does is projected as a representation of all Black men.
Yes, absolutely. This is what's going on now with Diddy. This is what went on with Michael Jackson. This is what went on with R. Kelly. It's not just that they themselves are accused of having done things. It's that the extent to which their accusations reflect on all Black men. It's not just Diddy up there, it's Black men that's up there. Because we can really, if we delve into the last 20 years of white males, celebrities and figures who have impact on society, who've engaged in some type of sexual debauchery, the list is incredible. But when you ask the general person about sexual debauchery and manhood or whatever, what do we think about? We think of the Michael Jacksons, the R. Kellys, and now the P. Diddy's. Right. We've become the face of it, but that goes back to very old stereotypes about Black male sexuality. Yes. I mean, when you talk about the Mandingo, you're fundamentally talking about an irrational being that is hypersexual to his core. He's almost animalistic and incapable of engaging, most particularly women, beyond sexual objectification. These ideas stick with us, and they're propagated every generation, most particularly in media. So we become the face of this in many different ways. And shout out to LMA. Immediately popped to MLA. But when he pointed out Julia Childs, the movie I was talking about was with Meryl Streep playing Julia Childs. And that was where that scene comes in. But anyway, so thank you for that. LMA is dropping all the facts.
Yeah. LMA, he's always on point. He's one of our biggest supporters. So shout out to LMA. Shout out to LMA.
Appreciate that. Because I wasn't expecting to talk about this, so this stuff pops in my head and I don't remember people's names, so I really appreciate that. But no, going back to social failure, I think in that respect, that's one of the reasons why it's so prevalent and it's so funny and it's accepted. And of course, when you talk about sitcoms, we can go back to Good Times, I
Right.
mean, the most popular
Absolutely.
character is JJ, and he's a
Yeah.
buffoon. He's a social failure.
Yeah.
Right? He's still living with his mama as a grown man. I mean, these are so we can talk about this in so many different sitcoms we've seen over the years where black male failure is the butt of the joke. Right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I can even think of a TV show that I grew up watching. Of course, I grew up in the 80s and 90s. There was a TNBC, the block of programming geared towards teenagers in the late 90s, early 2000s. The TV show was City Guys. And one of the characters was a black guy who was obviously older than the typical age of a high schooler. And his name was L Train. Right, and he was the butt of the jokes. As he was basically a dumb jock. He was stupid, almost to the point where he was considered mentally disabled. That's how stupid he was.
Oh man, I was watching Scary Movie the other night. I was just flipping channels, and Marlon Wayans playing the weed head character who never quite gets his stuff together. He's just sitting around smoking weed, and he's so high he doesn't even comprehend the danger he's in much of the time, right? But I think one of the best examples of this, if people can find it, which should be easy on YouTube, there's an old clip of Richard Pryor where he does a skit when for the short-lived Richard Pryor show, which was brilliant. But he does a skit playing the president. He's playing the first black president, and he's fielding questions from journalists, right, the way a president does. And of course, somebody brings up his infidelity and whatnot, and and not only infidelity, but his penchant for white women, right? But the whole skit is framed around a successful black man who reaches the pinnacle, right? President of the United States, and he's still brought low by something like his sexual attraction to women and white women in particular. Social failure, even amidst success. But when it comes to black men, this is expected. And in many respects, this is one of the reasons that I think people were so shocked that Obama didn't have any sexual scandals.
Right.
He got walked into office with a black woman and 2 black kids, and you didn't hear anything about him grabbing nobody or infidelity or any of that. People were shocked that he survived.
That's why one of the things I like about Kevin Samuels, he talked about that part of being a high value man is you need to have what? You need to be sexually disciplined. It's very, very important. Very important that you have sexual discipline. I would agree with that wholeheartedly. And it's a major issue. And one of the things that people don't talk about is when we talk about these, typically we see in our community young men who are what we consider failures. No one ever talks about the fact that when we look at them being emotionally immature, sexually deviant, emotionally reckless, right, lacking self-control, no one ever discusses who's raising the child.
Yeah.
Right? Because a tree by the fruit it bears, for crying out loud, right? So these are issues as well that oftentimes aren't discussed when we look at issues that black males face.
If I can just quickly mention, Snapshot Reviews said something interesting. He was talking about the show Power and the character James St. Patrick, right? This is about a drug dealer who's trying to go straight and do well. He's not just trying to get a job somewhere. He owns his own club, and he's trying to transition out of drug dealing, right? And ultimately, spoilers, I'm not going to go into detail, he doesn't succeed, right?
Okay. Because I never watched the show, so
yeah, I'm not. It's there are aspects of the show that are brilliant. 50 Cent did some really interesting things, but again, a lot of his shows are dealing with black male drug dealers, so that's a whole nother discussion. But at least in the context of Power, you're talking about ultimately at the cusp of victory, right, where he's really about to transition into a life that is beyond the street, and he's going to be separate from it. He fails. Social failure, right? We seldom see shows where you see black men thrive and achieve, and they're willing, they're able to do so, especially based on their wits. But most importantly, we rarely see black men succeed, and most particularly African American men. That becomes a whole nother conversation. But we rarely get to see that because I think the public is far more accustomed to seeing black men fail and identify with black male failure more so than black male success.
Unless it's in an academic or entertainment realm.
Well, in entertainment realm, most particularly, I would say people aren't even accustomed.
I mean athletic or entertainment.
Okay. Yeah. I was going to say I don't think people are accustomed to black male success in academic.
Yeah.
Athleticism, you're allowed to succeed. Entertainment, you're allowed to succeed. But if you fall, it's no surprise.
Right. Yeah, and I give a great example. Floyd Mayweather. The big push was, he has to fight Manny Pacquiao. People know I was a resident Floyd Mayweather fan. I started following his career after he was given the gold medal and with the bronze medal in '96 Olympics in Atlanta. I'm a huge boxing connoisseur. And I remember he said, I'm damned if I do, damned if I don't. This is a no-win situation. He said, because when I beat him, they're going to say, well, you're supposed to win. You're the natural bigger guy, and you're naturally the better boxer. He says, if I lose, they're going to say, well, you weren't what we thought you were. Right? He said, so, I'm not going to get the credit no matter what.
Right. No, this is the reality of it. Black male failure is an expected part of the dynamic. Our successes are treated as an anomaly.
Absolutely.
And at the end of the day, that failure becomes a consequence of anti-Black misandry. But when you put it in an entertainment context, in order for people to truly identify with it, it's almost like that needs to be there more so than the successes.
So we're in the fourth quarter now, folks. We're in the fourth quarter now. Flat blackness, flat maleness, and Black andromortality, the collapsing of nuance. You state in chapter 4 that the focus is more so on not what is said, but what is not said. Can you unpack for us?
Well, you talking particularly about which, is it one concept you want me to start with? Anyone?
Wherever you will. So you talk about, of course, beginning of chapter 4, flat blackness. The conceptual idea of flattening simply refers to the collapsing of nuance. This chapter will talk about the flattening of nuance regarding notions of blackness and maleness. You talk about conceptually flatness pertains to race, gender, and more particularly regarding men. It most often occurs by abstraction, meaning it is not what is said about blackness or maleness, it's what is not said. It's the absence of, yes.
Okay, so when I talked about blackness, now, first of all, the concept of flat blackness, I first heard from Yvette Carnell and Antonio Moore, who come out of the ADOS movement.
Yes.
And they were talking about flat blackness on a racial level.
Right.
I started talking about a secondary definition on gender terms. And because, so an example I gave is there was a commercial by Xfinity at one point in time where they were, I think this might have been right around the Olympics, where they were, the commercial was about a Black woman swimmer, I think it was, who did really well. And I think it was being celebrated around Black History Month and Women's History Month, right? So the commercial fit into both months. This was a few years ago. So they were talking about Black women in the Olympics. And so she was a swimmer and she was doing her thing. And they started showing different women in the Olympics doing their thing. And the narration of it was by a woman. And she named 2 of the women that did really well. I think maybe even 2 or 3. And then they showed this quick clip of Jesse Owens.
Right.
The announcer just mentioned a runner. I thought that was extremely interesting, right? So when I was talking about flat blackness, what I was saying is there are ways that where Black males are implied, where there's some type of cachet, there's some type of social equity that they can pull from Black men without actually having to name them. Give another example. If you talk about BLM, right? BLM would talk about the rates of police brutality. They would talk about the rates of police homicide. And I remember they did a commercial, I want to say it was based in LA. And they had a bunch of people in the room in front of the camera when they were talking about police homicide. They were talking about the rates of it. And in the commercial, they showed one woman and one man, over and over again when they were talking about one woman and one man, one woman and one man. And they kept talking about police homicide and they were giving stats on police homicide. And I was like, this is really interesting because really when you look at it, the rates on police homicide are overwhelmingly male. At the time I wrote that, I want to say there might have been about 8 to 11 women across the country that were Black women that were killed by police officers. And there were about 250 to 300 Black men. Right. And so what I was saying is, have this instance where BLM is talking about, how dangerous police homicide is. And they're right, it is. But the way they went about it was to imply that these levels were equal. Right. They didn't want to actually say that this is something Black males suffer from because fundamentally this is a Black feminist organization. And to give ground to say that this is something that Black males suffer from, especially when it's the number one issue that drew them attention. Remember, whenever a Black man died after the advent of BLM, they were there on the scene. They would set up movements and they would talk about it. But once they got your attention, they would bait and switch the discussion to Black feminist or LGBT issues.
Absolutely.
And the leadership across the country in terms of the various chapters were overwhelmingly led by women and LGBT. And they were actually quoted as having told men, and I sat in on BLM meetings where I heard this, where the men were supposed to take a back seat for perceived violations against the Black community in the 60s and 70s, right? Where it's now women's time to lead, it's LGBT's time to lead, so men need to take a back seat, right? And even when they got funding, they only funded, and I did a show about this, they only funded the chapters of BLM that were led by women and LGBT groups.
Right, you mentioned that.
They were led by straight Black men, they kind of ignored you, and you weren't even considered a chapter much of the time. So that said, what I was noticing with BLM is when they wanted to get attention, they focused on Black male death. When they wanted to get attention and bring stats out, they focused on stats that overly relied on Black male death. But when it came to actually talking about how much of this was actually experienced by Black men and women, they would obscure the representation of the data, just like Kimberly Crenshaw does for African American Policy Forum group. Yeah. They obscure the data so it either presents that this is something that's equally experienced by both, or it's more so experienced by women. So the data is still useful, but the presentation of it denies Black men's experiences, Black boys' experiences. And so when I talked about flat Blackness, that was what I was referring to. The way that the Black male and female experience can be flattened and presented in a manner that, advocated for women and girls to receive a certain amount of attention, but downplayed and ignored Black males when desirable.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so when we talk about Black Lives Matter, we're really talking about seeing in the contemporary moment Black male death being used as political currency.
Yes, absolutely. And notice that political currency didn't go anywhere in a way that benefited Black males.
Absolutely. Yes.
I mean, one could argue that you can point a line between 2015 death of Michael Brown, rise of BLM, to Kamala heading toward the executive to the presidential spot. Not to say she's going to win or isn't going to win, but simply to say that the line between Black women rising through protest via BLM and this push for representational electoral politics, that there's a connection there in terms of attention, perception, particularly by liberals, white liberals at that. Right, the kind of currency they built up, really going back to the end of the civil rights movement, the rise of the feminist era. A lot of what feminists did in the early 70s was to transfer some of the equity of the civil rights movement to their movement, and they invited Black women to participate in that engagement. So I'm saying from there all the way through the rise of BLM, all the way through the push for Kamala into office, what you're seeing was an attempt to push Black women forward, even if it's at the expense of Black men and boys. I mean, remember, I think it's Nina Turner just recently said that the Democrat Party emasculates Black men, right? This is somebody who was an elected official in the Democrat Party.
Yeah, she's from Ohio. I've met her before, yes.
Yeah. So I mean, this is not something that I'm just coming up with that we don't experience. Right. This is a phenomenon that's real. And so in that respect, you have a cadre of women that are taking advantage of this, and they're happy to use Black male death if need be to propel their position. But when it comes to actually advocating for Black males as a demographic,
no, absolutely not. Andro mortality.
Yeah. The whole section of that chapter deals with the various ways, not only the ways, but the stats, the data around how Black men die. Right. And what are the causes, the primary causes, and to what extent are they, far beyond other demographics. And the reason I did that is I wanted to provide a snapshot of how vulnerable Black men are in terms of health, in terms of longevity, in terms of life expectancy, and the various ways we die, to a greater extent than others. To me, that chapter was the hardest to write, but it was also a way of really trying to point out to the reader, Black men are extremely vulnerable, and this is how. And so, andro mortality just basically gives a snapshot on the dominant ways that we pass and to what extent it tends to be far beyond other demographics.
Understood.
So suicide, HIV, you can name police. There's so many different areas we could talk about, but that I wanted to give brothers the data around this is how we die, and I don't want you to forget it. That's what that the purpose of that was.
Understood. So we talk about solutions here at Lumumba Speaks and Be Equaline Network. Chapter 5, the 17-point Black male political agenda. You said now that you stated it's a living document and that you now have there's 18 points rather than 17. So I would have make the presumption that you've added one, or maybe someone went on and added one. So we're not going to hit all 17. We'll hit just 3. Then, of course, we're going to open this up for conversations, and hopefully we can keep you for about another 30 minutes because we don't want to monopolize your time. And I'm here on the East Coast as well with Eastern Standard Time. Okay. But you talk about family court reform, child custody, mandatory DNA testing, right? So when people talk about this, typically feminists go crazy, but you argue that this is needed and necessary to protect the rights of men.
Absolutely. Matter of fact, here I just put a link to the website in the chat. Not sure. Oh, it didn't go through. Okay.
It didn't go through.
Well, here, I'll just show this.
Okay.
That's right okay. Thank you. All right. So this is the website. So you can just go to newblackmasculinities.wordpress.com. And what you'll find when you get to the website, it is the pinned right here. It's the latest. It's always going to be at the top. It's the pinned blog post. And when you get to it, you'll see it there. 18-point Black male political agenda. Now, I hope to be wrong. I am waiting for someone to correct me because I do not want to be right about this. But this is the first and only Black male political agenda I've been able to find. Now, that lays out a series of policy ideas written by Black men. And there's a PDF version if you want to download it for yourself. But this is written by Black men, not by me. I didn't sit down and write these out. These are ideas that the 40,000 members of the Onyx Report, my show on YouTube, contributed. And you can see the latest update was on October 9th. Right. Matter of fact, this PDF version was just loaded up yesterday. So you can download that. But what you can see here is this is what the 18 points are. And they're identified by state, federal, and or both in terms of what they relate to. This is the streamlined list. And if you go down below it, it's the list in more detail. Right. But you can just see here in the streamlined list, these are the points. And the interesting thing about it is the very first point, family court reform, has the most number of subpoints, 17.
Yes, it does.
And more than any other point on here. And this is, one of the reasons we talk about this, because when I asked Black men, all I asked them to do was to give me a policy idea that will improve the quality of life for Black men and boys. And we provide extra information and we put some data to it much of the time, not all the time, but we just try and do that. But for the most part, this is just a list of ideas, that policy ideas that can be implemented, not only to improve the quality of Black male life, but if you want Black male votes, this is one way to get it. Most of the time, and again, this tends to happen every presidential bid every 4 years. At some point, a candidate will put a mic in Black males' faces and say, what is it you guys want?
Right.
Usually it's in some setup in a barbershop somewhere. You know what I mean?
Barbershop talk, right.
That was the barbershop talk. But for the most part, what you'll find is Black men, we talk about the community mostly. I mean, we most of us do not know how to talk about Black male political issues separate from the community, separate from any other demographic. We don't know how to do it. So we give generic answers. We talk about things that may benefit the whole Black community. And in many ways, I've been saying we kind of speak about Blackness not a whole lot different than we did after the rise of the Black Power movement. We talk about Blackness in a communal sense, much the way Ice Cube was trying to do in the Cocktails with Queens interview. We talk about Blackness in a communal sense and how we can improve the standing of the community. And if not that, at the very least, most Black men can't tell you a policy idea that would benefit Black males, except maybe something having to do with incarceration. Well, here's a list that I provide for Black men, written by Black men, to say these are all issues that pertain to us in a way that, you might really want to look over. Right. So from family court reform, where we talk about mandatory DNA testing at birth, and that's just one of the 17 subpoints. We talk about education. We talk about, you can see it all kind of laid out there. Criminal law reform and law enforcement, intimate partner violence as it relates to Black men, Black male health, targeted business support. So these are all specific ideas laid out by Black men, Black men's right to self-defense. We talk about the latest idea, point 18, that was added after the book, is the false accusation offender registry, which is basically a list, or should be a nationally accessible registry of people who have laid false claims, most particularly in regard to sexual assault.
Yes.
Right. they should be on a registry, and there should be some type of social punishment for having done so. Especially if you're a business owner and you're looking to hire people, you want to make sure that you're not hiring somebody that has a record of falsely accusing not only people, but companies.
Because the company could then be liable if this person makes an accusation while they're employed. Yes,
Absolutely. So we think that there should be a false accusation offender registry. So these are the facts. And usually when I tell men stuff like that, it's like, you know what I mean? Like, I mean, I had a conversation with a barber a couple months ago here in Fresno, a real good brother. But he was saying, you know, I don't really think there are any political differences between black men and women. He said, I think we have the same agenda. And I think all of this black male talk is ridiculous. I said, okay. I sent him this list. And I said, all right, if you don't think there's a difference between, you know, black male political interests and black female political interests, I said, go ahead and have this conversation in a room of black women and tell me if you're able to get through the first 3 subpoints of the first point on the agenda. So, you know, I asked him, so we can go down to it. Child custody, we're saying that this should be an automatic 50-50 upon divorce, unless there are circumstances that suggest that one parent should have more or less. It should be an automatic 50-50 child custody arrangement upon divorce. We talk about the presumption of law as far as the 50-50 custody, but okay, so that's the first point is about child custody. The second one is the mandatory paternity testing at birth, right? The third one, reinstituting at-fault divorce standards. We talk about termination of parental obligation. If a woman has the right to choose, a man should have the right to not want to participate in the pregnancy if he doesn't.
What you call financial abortion.
That was the older term. We updated the term to termination of parental obligation. But we're just saying if women have the right to choose, men should have the right to choose, especially considering that, you know, after the Sex Act, you don't really have any say. But women, when it comes to birth control, they have, you know, technology that allows them, they can use before, during, and after the Sex Act to control a pregnancy. We don't. After the Sex Act, we are completely vulnerable. And that includes if you've had a vasectomy, if you worn a condom, a vasectomy may not take, the condom may break and rip, you never know. At the end of the day, once you've had sex, it is out of your hands. Whereas, you know, women have far more options. So we suggest in that regard that men should have the right to choose. Up to about 6 months after the pregnancy is discovered, a man should be given the right to decide if he wants to participate, as opposed to having one person decide what's going to happen to you for the next 18 years. You should have a say in that. So at the end of the day, and it's not something that everybody has to agree 100% with, but I guarantee you, for most black men, you're going to find something on this list that's not only going to make you think, but it's going to actually offer a series of ideas that you're probably not going to hear anywhere else, because people don't generally ask black men what their political interests are or what it would take to get their votes. And when they do ask, we often aren't prepared to give a critical answer. So I actually suggest that men read through this, and anything that really strikes out at you, that really hits you, use it, talk about it, you know, suggest it, put it out there, because we believe that instead of just giving our votes away, you know, that black men's vote should be earned.
Right.
I don't care who the candidate is, black, white, male, female. If you want my vote, this is what my vote requires. And if you're not willing to give me that, then you just can't expect that I'm going to give my vote simply because. And that's, you know, one of the problems that I think black folk are arguing with now in regard to, you know, who to vote for in this next upcoming election. We've been voting Democrat. Black men vote to the second highest degree. You know what? Here, I'm going to send you this in the private chat.
Okay.
And if you could share it, I'd appreciate it. For some reason,
No
I'm not
problem.
able to. But there you go.
Okay, I got it.
Yeah. So when you look at it, as far as the Democrats are concerned, black women vote to the highest degree. We vote to the second highest degree, but black women don't suffer from voter disenfranchisement the way we do.
Correct.
You know, if you came out of prison, you know, if you've done any time at all, whether or not you're able to vote is up for grabs, depending on the state that you're in and what the policies are. So we suffer from voter disenfranchisement more than any other group, really. But we still vote Democrat to the second highest degree, and many of us don't really even have a requirement for what we should get for our votes, particularly as it relates to black males.
Correct.
And so we're just suggesting that, hey, this is a list, and this is written by brothers who've gone through it. Most of the points on here is something somebody went through that other brothers could identify with. So again, I didn't write this. I curate it, I archive it, I put it up on this document, and anybody, and you can see, you go to the bottom of it, you can leave, you can suggest an idea, you can leave a comment, you can put an idea there, you can email me. I can be found at Fresno State. It's pretty easy to find my email address. But at the end of the day, if you want to propose an idea to add to the agenda, whether it's something separate from the 18 points or it falls under them, you're welcome to do so. And just provide at least 3 to 5 sentences explaining your idea, as well as some links to back your argument, and we'll go from there. That's what we're putting forth now.
And let me ask you this. You talk about one of those part of that 18-point black male political agenda, criminal law reform, but you also talk about, I want to talk specifically about licensing law enforcement. You talk about having a revocable license similar to lawyers, doctors, when officers are engaging in malfeasance.
Yeah. I recently heard somebody talking about this, and I'm blanking on where I heard it from, but they were saying that wherever this issue is even brought up, I think it's, well, let me find it. Yeah, licensing and qualified immunity. But they were saying that, you know, wherever this issue even remotely comes up, police officers will move to a police department that doesn't require that, right? Because at the end of the and it's not all illegitimate. Sometimes the argument is that they might be falsely accused and they may have to pay out of pocket for something, so on and so forth. So there are going to be arguments no matter what. But we propose licensing law enforcement on the basis that, you know, there needs to be some type of accountability, and there needs to be an ongoing concern from, you know, officers that they may actually be held liable for their behavior. We believe that the way black men have been treated by law enforcement, that isn't much to ask, all considered. Because black men can be killed outright and everybody's good with it.
Absolutely. So let me ask you this. Have you all been able to connect with any politicians regarding this political agenda?
I've had, well, the way it is, I don't really connect with them. I've had them connect with me.
Okay.
And what generally happens is, so far it's been about 3 or 4, and they kind of contact me under the table. I guess my image is, you know, and the stuff because I have over almost 700 shows on my YouTube channel. So, and I understand it as a politician, when you're dealing with people publicly, you're not just dealing with who's standing next to you, you're dealing with everything they've ever said and done. So, you know, unless you're dealing with another polished politician that's had their record scrubbed, you could be accused of believing with, you know, somebody, and they said something 12 years ago that was, you know, politically incorrect, and now you somehow are associated with it. So I get it.
Right.
But I've had, you know, Republicans and Democrats, you know, reach out and say, look, you know, Senator such and such wants to meet with you about your agenda. You know, I've had a governor and a couple of lower level politicians reach out. You know, there's been about 3 or 4 states across the country. And, you know, they're looking at specific issues. And some of these things, mind you, are up for discussion, you know, in various states. Whether it has to do with our agenda or not, I don't know. I don't really care, to be honest with you, as long as the policies are on the table. That's more so what I'm interested in. But, you know, it comes up. So the whole question, for example, of alimony, permanent alimony in Florida was brought up earlier this year. And that was something that was pushed back on in Florida. You have, you know, DNA testing at birth in, I want to say, Texas, that came up, and maybe Tennessee. Like, some of these issues are, you know, becoming more popular. And what politicians are starting to figure out is, if they want the male vote, they're going to actually have to do more for it. Because when you read through the agenda, there's a lot here that men across race might agree with. Yeah, I focus it on black males, and I'm unapologetic in doing so. But look, if white, Latino, Asian cats want to get on board and support a policy,
so be it. Yeah,
so be it. If my only question is, does the policy benefit black males? That's my only question. So if everybody wants to get on board and pass it, okay. My job at that point is just to make sure that black men don't get lost in the sauce. Because you see, you know, intersectionality, for example, you know, really got appropriated away from Crenshaw. White women kind of absorb that. You hear corporations talking about intersectionality. They're not talking about black women being the most oppressed group. They literally have changed the definition, right, from what Kimberly Crenshaw and other Black feminists initially meant. So, these things can be absorbed and appropriated in ways that don't benefit the groups that created the concept. So I'm well aware of that. So my goal is to make sure Black males remain at the forefront of these various ideas, but I can't, I do understand they can apply to a lot of different people. So when they start talking about ending permanent alimony in Florida, they were not thinking about Black men.
Right. Understood. So what we're going to do now, and I appreciate your time, brother, because I know we touched base maybe about a year ago. Then we kind of, felt, kind of parted ways, or, kind of got lost in the sauce. But then we were able to reconnect, and you, of course, immediately said, hey, when are you available? So I greatly appreciate that. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to put the link in the chat, family. If you want to tap in, ask some questions of course, Dr. T. Hasan Johnson regarding his work, regarding, of course, anti-Black misandry, flat Blackness, and, of course, flat maleness, you're more than welcome to do so. And then, of course, we would close out. And then hopefully you have a little time we could talk offline after we end the show. It'd be great.
Well, I think so, but I want to apologize, man. I did not mean to leave you hanging. I think the last 2 years, it was a combination of my son graduating high school and getting him to college, and then last year was it was getting him to college and dealing with that. So I just was overwhelmed for a minute.
No, it's quite all right. It's quite all right, because actually, when I was in the midst of finishing my dissertation, they'll tell you I was not around really to do anything. People are like, when are you going to do a show? Look, I'm writing. I've collected this data. Now I need to go through data analysis. I got to go through axle coding, theoretical coding. You know what I'm talking about.
Oh, so, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
And LMA, I saw you trying to tap in. I don't know what happened, but you could come back. Once again, family, the link is in the description. Link is in the chat. And if you're watching on Twitter, you're more than welcome to come on over to YouTube at Lumumba Speaks or Bequaline Network to be part of the conversation. Once again, if you're watching on Twitter, I see that we do have a sizable amount of viewers on Twitter. You could come on over to YouTube at Lumumba Speaks and Bequaline Network. Of course, the Pan-African social media extraordinaire, the home of Africa-centered news and information. We're having a conversation with the great Dr. T. Hasan Johnson, one of the four, I would argue, one of the more prominent, preeminent voices of Black male studies in the academy. We're just great that you're able to grace our presence here on our platform. I've actually cited your work almost ad nauseum when we have conversations on my platform regarding Black men. We actually did a show on, of course, the Myth of Black Male Privilege show. So I quote you a lot, and it's a blessing to have you here and people be able to know who you are in person.
Oh, no, I appreciate that, man.
Yes, sir.
I don't know how many people read that paper, but I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so one of the things that Dr. T. Hasan Johnson argued in the paper was that many of the narratives, the concepts, the ideas regarding Black men, not only in society, but even in terms of the family, were based on ideology and not what the facts, data, or statistics. Right. Yeah. So there's something, once again, to consider. And oftentimes we're socialized to view ourselves even from a misandric frame of reference. So that is something to consider. Maybe that's something maybe we could collaborate on in terms of internalizing misandry, anti-Black misandry. But LMA, go right ahead. Brother LMA used to dribble down in VA.
Your mic is off.
Yeah, LMA, your mic is off. You got to turn your mic on.
Or unmute it.
Yeah, you got to unmute. He might be having some technical difficulties. Maybe. Okay, LMA, go right ahead.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. Great conversation. Nice to meet you, Dr. Johnson. I do have a question. I didn't know how to word it. When I saw the topic, this idea was bouncing in my head. I'm trying to word it. So I'm not as scholastic as you guys are. So bear with me. My question is,
you are organic intellectual. Don't play yourself like that.
So my question is, how do we as Black men, from a Black male masculinist perspective, defend ourselves in the public and social, economic, and political arena while not, I guess, antagonizing Black women or our counterpart in a sense? Because, for me, I think that the most important relationship that a black man can have is with his black woman. And obviously we've been butting heads for the last couple of, decades, honestly. But I don't want to like paint the whole community with a broad brush that every black man's fighting with every black woman. No, we all, some of us get along, but there is some headbutting. And, it's kind of like if you say something about, like, you may have a general issue, this goes back and forth. You can have a general issue with black men, or a black woman. You have a general issue with black men, but as a black man, you're kind of going to, you're going to feel like you get hit with a stray. Same thing with women. You may have a general issue with women, but you see how it, even with the like just the discourse we have, like, men may make a general critique of black women, but a lot of women would take issue with it. And so my question is, how do we as black men project ourselves, fill the role as black men, black masculine energy in our community, defend ourselves against incursions from either, whether it be, black women, but mostly black, white people, white men, white women. How do we project ourselves? How do we defend ourselves without also deteriorating or yeah? You see, I think you get my question.
So very, very quickly before you answer that question, Dr. Johnson, I got to go over the ground rules. I do this every show. You all who watch me, you know that diversity of thought is welcome, irrespective if you're on the left, you're on the right down the middle. No problem there. No epithets of any kind are allowed on my platform. You all know that. No racial epithets, no epithets of any kind. This is a space of black empowerment. We believe in the 3 N's of black power, which are self-respect, self-defense, and of course, self-determination. Facts over feelings. If there's a position you disagree with, you attack the argument, not the person. No ad hominems, right? Attack the argument, not the person. Facts over feelings, and no fundamentally false statements. So you can believe, for example, that LeBron James is the greatest basketball player who ever played. But if your position is that he's the greatest basketball player ever because Michael Jordan only won 2 championships, that is a fundamentally false statement. And of course, I will intercede in the conversation because as this is my platform, I can't allow someone to promote information that, of course, is not factual on my platform, that is adverse to the facts. And then, of course, last but not least, you all know here at Lumumba Speaks and Be Line Network, our mission is neither to exonerate or vilify, but simply to challenge conventional wisdom and re-examine what has previously been accepted as fact. So without further ado, Dr. Johnson, go right ahead.
Well, I think there are multiple schools of thought on this, LMA. There are some, especially in the academy, because Black male studies is fundamentally rooted in the academy. Most of the brothers are scholars and professors and whatnot. And many of them are in departments that are, if not run by women, are predominated by women. So you have brothers who are very, very technical, very calculated on to what extent they involve themselves because, they could lose their jobs, have their professional reputations damaged, things of that nature. So you have one major approach I've seen, which is to be very calculated, very careful about how things are represented and how things are brought to bear, and whatnot. So you have that kind of approach. I'm personally more of the school of thought that this is going to happen no matter what. No matter how well spoken, no matter how careful or articulate, you're going to be called a misogynist. You're going to be called a sexist simply because you advocate for men. Now, that doesn't mean that there should be a license to be unnecessarily abusive or problematic or argumentative just for the sake of arguing. I don't believe in that. I think you can conduct yourself respectfully while at the same time holding a position. But I tend to come into it knowing that at the end of the day, and this is because I've seen this for the last 20 years, no matter how well spoken, well articulated you are, you're going to get these accusations regardless, simply because of your position, simply because you're going against the grain, as it were. And for some people, feminism has almost become a religion in the sense that it's not something that requires data or accuracy. It's simply right because it exists. And when you're engaging people who believe that their position is right because it exists, almost anything you say is going to be a problem. You know what I mean? So I don't advocate for, just purely being egregious just to be egregious, arguing to argue. That's not what I stand for at all. But I try to tell brothers, if you're going to come into that argument, these are the things that are going to be lobbed at you. And, the best you can do is prepare yourself with, information, with data, with resources, with arguments, with concepts that best help you articulate the position. But as long as you're doing that in good faith, and you're not arguing to hurt people or arguing just to argue, expect the blows, expect the blowback, and always be strategic about how you're going about it. Because I mean, much of Black YouTube are people who are hiding their identities because they can't afford, something negative to happen to them. I get it. It is what it is. I mean, how many professors do you see on YouTube arguing something controversial that have their face and their name publicly available? It's a risk. The only thing I would suggest is that you do so in good faith and you do so as strategically as possible, but you know that you're going to catch those slings and arrows simply because of the position you take. And you just kind of weigh the consequences of each discussion. I think it tends to work best if you're able to be honest and forthright in what you're saying, and just move forward. But that's me. Some people, like I said, tend to be extremely careful, extremely calculated. They stay out of the fray unless it's absolutely necessary. And they only say as much as necessary to make the point and get out of the way. Any of those, I understand based on whatever your position is. You got to do the best you can do. But that's kind of what I've seen. So,
And if you don't mind, I have one more question, almost like a follow-up question. So from a Black masculinist perspective, what role, let's say, well, what role does the Black masculinist have to play in the community, like as his obligation, if any, duty, if any, to Black women and Black children? And does that role or diminish when there's gender warring going on? And I think that'll be my final question.
You say when there's gender what?
Gender, like, we're kind of having like a gender war going on. That's what we call it that, but it's kind of like some low line hostilities between, yeah. So basically, what is our role in the community? What obligations do we have to the Black woman?
I see. Okay.
Even if we're still,
the way, I mean, I tend to look at this historically, and you can see this in terms of how I wrote the book as well. Again, I'm Gen X, so I grew up in a period where I saw these arguments go from, I was born in 74, so the rise of white feminism, second wave white feminism, late 60s, I wasn't there for that. But from the 70s onward, I saw this rise. And one of the things I noticed as it pertained to Black men is you had about 50 years of a one-way discussion going on in the public about Black men, from movies to television to literature to the academy. You had Black men were monsters, Black men were trifling, this was standard fare for Black men for almost 50 years. It's really been in the last 10 that Black men have been using social media to respond. This is another reason why I say you're going to catch slings and arrows no matter what, because so many people have normalized this kind of discussion about Black men for so long that any pushback against it is going to be met with a degree of hostility. That said, as far as what roles Black men have, what allegiances and connections Black men have to the Black family, I talk about this in the first chapter of the book, where I'm really looking at the Black family itself and what issues we're facing and what questions have to be answered. And for Black men, the question to be answered is whether or not there is an opportunity for healing, for the Black family to heal. And a lot of that is going to depend, in terms of where the discussion is now, on to what extent Black women are actually willing to recognize how they've been used as Trojan horses, most particularly against Black males, but in regards to the Black community in and of itself. That's where the crux of it is. I mean, individual Black men can definitely make statements about their allegiance to Black family and the Black community in general, but then you have Black men that are saying, you know what, I'm going to go find a family elsewhere. And it isn't to say they're looking for non-Black families. And if you've heard of passport bros, you got brothers that are going all over the world, and many of them are going to Africa or the Caribbean or South America to find Afro-Latina wives and girlfriends. It's not just, a lot of people just suggest it's a sex trade. No, it's actually brothers who are looking for wives and significant others. And many of them are finding Black women elsewhere. So you have a lot of this happening. And the question is, if this cannot be resolved, if women in particular are unwilling to look at and listen to what Black men are saying because it's seen as too controversial, too offensive, it is not willing to be a discourse there. Well, if that's the case, you have Black men choosing to build family in alternative ways. The extent to which Black men are tied to figuring it out, I leave to every man to decide on his own. What I try to do in the book is present to you how we got here, what role policy played, and to lay out the situation in such a way that the answer to whether or not this can be resolved falls to, you know, how willing people are going to be to actually have the discussion. I don't mean the dating discussion. You see a lot of that now. Well, who's going to accept a man that makes, what woman is finally going to accept a man that makes less than 6 figures and she's willing to deal with him? And what man is going to accept a woman without a BBL? I'm not talking about that crap. I'm talking about these are policy influenced worldviews that have been shaped over half a century at least. Are we willing and are we able to get past that? First, to recognize it and then and actually frame a response to it. And if we're unable or unwilling, most particularly the women, the men have already started to look to alternatives to that. You know, to what extent is up in the air and it's still to be answered. You know, so really, you know, you are the ones that answer that question in your life choices. You know, and when you're talking to brothers who have done this, who've been married a couple times, who've lived it over and over again and have decided to go find a wife elsewhere or to be a monk. You got 14-year-old boys that are deciding to be monks just because of what they grew up seeing in their households and what they're seeing online. And they're done. They don't even want to enter into the fray of it. You know, these are the questions that each of us has to answer on our own.
Mr. Right 2024. Mr. Right 2024. There you go.
Fellas, how y'all doing?
Doing quite all right.
Oh, how about yourself?
Much respect. Much respect. I'm enjoying the conversation. I wanted to add my 2 cents a little bit. I don't know if it was discussed because I chimed in halfway through. I was wondering if anyone noticed that Goldman Sachs has decided to invest, I think it was $10 billion into 1 million Black women. Now, me as a patriarchal Black man, I would ask, why does Goldman Sachs want to invest $10 billion in Black women, not Black men?
You're breaking up on us a little bit.
Yeah, I think I heard the question though. I've been talking about this for the last 4 years, and this kicked up especially during the pandemic because you saw this with PPP loans as well. They were giving them out to women to the point where brothers were using women as the face of their companies to get PPP loans at point. You know, you saw this happening. What you saw with Goldman Sachs happen with Google, MasterCard, Visa. There was a number of other companies that started to do these Black women, you know, kind of prioritize. You might have to mute that. I don't. But anyway, I've seen. So I've been talking about this for several years. You rarely, if ever, see these things targeted at Black males. Matter of fact, you're starting to see white conservative men taking Black women organizations to court because the resources that are earmarked only for Black women, they're arguing is unconstitutional, and they're starting to win. I mean, we saw this with what's the name of the company? I don't want to say Feeling Fierce. I'm blanking on the name
Fearless,
right now.
Fearless Fun.
Fearless
And it was
Fun. Thank you.
Ed Blum. Ed Blum was the guy who sued them.
See, Ella Baby coming with it, man. Thank you.
Yeah. I told you he's on point. He's on point.
I'm in these streets.
Right. Literally.
Yeah.
And you talk about this in your book as well, but go right ahead.
Yeah, no, we're starting to see a conservative blowback against it. But notice that blowback isn't being led by Black men. And that's mainly because Black men are unused to being helped. So we don't expect it. We're not used to safety nets because we never get them. Black women, on the other hand, have gotten very used to it. And the problem that some Black men have is not necessarily that we don't get a safety net the way they do, but that Black women don't advocate for their own men, their own sons, their own husbands to get the same resources that they're being given. Especially with the Goldman Sachs one, you haven't heard Black women say, you know what, our men need the same. As a matter of fact, the last major blow up along those lines is when Obama was pushing the LMA's gonna have to come in on this too because I'm forgetting the name.
Right, you're talking about the
My Brother's Keeper.
My Brother's Keeper. Black women were the first ones to tear it down. They started a nationwide list. What is it? What do you call it? Petition. They started a nationwide petition to have it torn down or to have it include girls. But there was already a council, a White House Council for Women and Girls that existed before My Brother's Keeper. And My Brother's Keeper wasn't even federally funded. It was privately funded,
Right.
and they were tearing it down. They could have applied that same national pressure to expanding the White House Council for Women and Girls to more specifically focus on Black girls. But instead of doing that, they attacked My Brother's Keeper. So it's not just that you have resources going to Black women, but you have it being, gate guarded to prevent Black males from getting it at every turn. And this is a problem. So at the end of the day, when people ask, how is this happening? First of all, Goldman Sachs and no other corporation inherently just cares for Black women. What you have happening is that Black women have a history of college degrees to a greater extent than Black males do. Right about now, we're only a few percentage points off each other. Black women only have a certain, I think it's like 4 or 5 percentage points more higher in terms of getting college degrees right now. But if you look at it from the late 1970s to now, Black men have half the degrees that Black women do. So Black women have been getting degrees. And what that means is they've been moving into white collar areas, especially since the 1970s and 80s, right? Into corporations and whatnot. Now, it hasn't been an easy march. Affirmative action helped a bit, but much of the time they might have been hired as consultants rather than straight up employees. But my point here is that they've been getting into these spaces for several decades. Black men, not always welcome to the same extent, especially when you look at the impact of not having college degrees to the same extent over the last few decades. So Black women, and for every one of these corporations, Goldman Sachs included, when you really look at how those policies came about, it was Black women in the corporations that made proposals within those corporations to advertise and advocate for Black women and girls only. They weren't talking about the Black community. They weren't talking about Black oppression. They were talking about Black girls and women only. That's it. And when they got those resources, they went to Black girls and women only. They didn't turn around and advocate for their husbands, their sons, their boyfriends, their fathers. They didn't say we're in this together. They didn't say we're a community. Now, notice the question Dr. Lumumba asked a moment ago, or not the statement he made in regard to us being a community and functioning as a community. That's not the nature of these conversations, particularly in these corporations. Black women are advocating for themselves. So over the last 4 years, we've seen a number of grants, corporate investments, things of that nature that are primarily targeted to Black women, and nobody says a word about Black men. Now, how does a community function like that? You have one corporation alone investing $10 billion in 1 million Black women. And nobody said anything to advocate for men at all. What would happen if Black men got $10 billion invested in 1 million Black men from one corporation? What do you think the response would be from Black women? Right. You think they would take that?
It'd be bombs over Baghdad.
Yeah, it would be exactly what it was when it was My Brother's Keeper. But have you heard one Black man talk about tearing down Goldman Sachs or anything like that in response to this?
No.
Let
me very quick. I recall even in your book, you talked about this concept of even a belief in Black female superiority, but articulated in the term Black girl magic.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the idea.
This concept that they're successful in having these achievements because there's something about themselves that's superior or better, special. Yeah.
Well, and the difference being, and we can apply this to the Goldman Sachs dynamic, for example, that they're there and they're advocating for each other and they're getting it because they're special. When historically we would talk about it more the way we did when we were talking about the man in the house rule. You didn't get welfare because you were special. I mean, the idea of it really came about during World War II when it came to widows who lost their men in war. This is the foundation of a lot of that welfare talk. So it wasn't because you were inherently better that you got those resources and Black men didn't. It had to do more with white women and being widows in World War II. And it ended up being something society took to provide sustenance for in regard to women and children. But what I'm saying here is, Black women who are really touting that their advancements have been a product of their specialness often are the same ones that refuse to acknowledge the extent to which the state has advocated for them in ways that it doesn't advocate for their men. So in other words, Black men are seen as failures, going back to social failure. We're seen as failures because we don't advance the way Black women do. And Black women pat themselves on the back saying we advance because we're special, rather than the state is investing in us in a way that they're not investing in men, which takes us back to Sedanius and the subordinate male target hypothesis, where he's pointing out the reason for that is because the war has always been between dominant and subordinate men. Black men are targeted for underdevelopment. Black women are targeted for certain kind of superficial symbols of access. And the reason I say that is because, you know, employed Black men still earn more. You just have more Black women employed, and they tend to be more stably employed. But at the end of the day, what Black women have been offered is superficial, but it's symbolic. And this is where you get ideas about Black girl magic, because, you know, the idea is that we've done these things and we get these things because we're special. No, you get these things because it's strategically useful. This really kicked up during the civil rights movement. And when you saw the rise of feminism and Black feminism in particular, that was considered the death knell for civil rights. Feminism was used as the death knell for civil rights. So this isn't something that happens because you're special. It happens because you're strategically useful.
Yes.
As a check against
political pawn, absolutely.
Yes, as a check against Black male advancement. And when you look at it from that vantage point, then you look back at Goldman Sachs and say, okay, why is there a $10 billion offer on the table to invest in 10 million in a million Black women? You know, it's something that's pushed for within the organization by Black women, and they see the value of it in terms of public perception, right? We're in this DEI diversity era. We're investing in Black women is something that makes the organization look good. But at the end of the day, it ends up being something that I think creates a further split in the Black community. Because fundamentally, the reason I say the gynocracy is a problem is because it throws into disarray Black family formation. So if you fundamentally believe you're better than your men because you have greater access than your men, and that your men are inherently failures because they're not able to advance and move in society the way you do, then how exactly do you form unions out of that?
Healthy unions.
Healthy unions.
Yeah.
How exactly does that work?
Healthy family dynamics. Because then that will permeate into how you raise the boy, the male child.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Gen X was the first generation to be raised under a more so a single parent framework. This is something that became, this is something boomers were doing, but it's Gen X that became the first generation to really experience single parent household, kind of framework to a greater extent than others. What we've seen come from that the absence of fathers has a particular effect on boys and young men. And being able to participate in families, let alone society, is declining in many ways. The girls are being prepared for leadership, being prepared for education. The boys, not so much. And without the masculine role model there,
it's not going to happen. And I would always talk. My best friend and I, we met in first grade, so we're talking about the fall of '89. And we talked about how we would have lasted the Mohicans, where we grew up with our fathers in the home. My parents have been married almost 50 plus years, right? Almost 50 years. And I thank them all the time. Like, the fact that I was able to grow up with that father figure, that having that masculine energy present. And so that helped me, of course, navigate life, right? And not be someone who was out of control, having a healthy sense of what it meant to be a man, right? Not an unhealthy sense where I was looking for masculinity in the wrong places. So I definitely think you're onto something.
But keep in mind, remember what you just told us a little while ago. You were told that you were oppressing the class with your masculinity, right?
Yeah, I was dominating the conversation. Monopolizing the conversation. Yeah,
with your and the masculinity that the Black community is no longer really familiar with. I mean, masculinity at this point is somewhat of an art form at this point, but for many, it's a remote art form. So the way people are socialized, it's more so perceived as a threat than it is as a positive. And something that Sandman just said is in terms of the $10 billion for 1 million Black women, he said it's $10,000 each. Think of it the way you would think about an NGO in Africa. If you think about an NGO going to a remote part of the continent where people are impoverished, something as simple as $5 can be hugely impactful. Now, for the most part, the African-American community falls behind most, economically speaking. As a matter of fact, many argue we are the only community that hasn't been repaired since the crash in 2008.
There's literature that suggests that African-American community is a colony in terms of when we talk about the concept of a former colonized nation, we fit many of those, of course, benchmarks, right? So that is something to consider as well. And when you talk about NGOs, oftentimes NGOs come in from a feminist frame of reference and do what? And we're going to talk about Africana womanism because I like the fact that you quoted her, you cited her in your work, and come in, and the goal is to what? Finance the mother, help the mother with the children, but exclude the father. We see this on the continent as well. So these issues are, of course, global. And I think this is an example of why Pan-Africanism is needed and necessary. But you also Kanoa Hudson-Weems, she talks about feminism in terms of, that nasty Western ideology that tries to break up the home, break up the family. She talks about, this is like page 1 of her book. Right. She mentions this. So,
well, but the only reason I brought up the NGOs was to point out how vulnerable economically the Black community is. So even though, $10,000 for each woman may not sound like much, when you're talking about a community that's vulnerable and has virtually no inherited wealth, it can make a huge difference when it comes to outcomes, and especially when you consider that Black men don't get this at all. So that being said, the question that I keep raising in my book about this is fundamentally, if we don't resolve this, how exactly do you maintain enough Black family formation for the continuance of the community we're talking about? If this can't be resolved and women are not willing to actually look at what role they've been kind of lured into historically, if we're not even going to have the conversation, here's the thing. Men are walking away. They're not voting. They're not necessarily in the streets holding signs, screaming about what they're frustrated about. That's not how men move. Men vote with their feet. And they don't vote, and they're not outspoken about it often, right? So what you're hearing online is a small space of men who are willing to try and explain what's going on. But the reality of it is men, Black men in particular, have been moving this way anyway. So whether you're talking about going monk, whether you're talking about going passport bro, whether you're talking about whatever, all of these little solutions that we're hearing about that people like or don't like is where Black men were going anyway, because it's the only credible response to the environment we're in. But getting married and doing what, the boomers did does not work. The divorce rates are too high. The family court treatment is too consistent. Men are stepping away from walking into that guillotine. And unless there's an alternative, a policy-based alternative that protects men to re-engage the family, we're going to see a continued a dismantling of the family structure, because it's at the end of the day, if the person laying next to you is the one that's willing to, put you out of the house and take you through divorce, I mean, at what point are you going to make a different decision? And when your kids watch this happen to you, and then the next husband that your mother might have, and then they get old enough and start having girlfriends treat them a certain way that's reminiscent of their mother. I mean, at some point, males are going to start doing it, and that's what's been happening.
Yeah, they're going to have to prioritize their wellness,
their well-being,
their well-being.
Yes. Yes, and that's what's already happening. So it's not really a debate point at this point. It's really a question of, all right, the ball is in sisters' courts. Brothers have laid this out. This is what's been happening. It's been going on for several generations. It has strategically undermined us. It's at the point where family formation is in question. Are you willing to really look at this, or are you just going to say that Black men ain't whatever, they're not capable or whatever? The question comes down to how willing is this going to be, how sincerely and in good faith is this conversation able to be had, where brothers can articulate their grievances and be heard, and there be some actionable steps. But at the end of the day, there's no incentive structure in place to change their behavior. So that said, men either take the chance, they abstain from society, or they look to form families elsewhere. And that's what's happening right now. That's what's happening right now.
Absolutely. Brother LMA, any thoughts?
Yes. I do have one question. It may be slightly not off topic, but maybe in a different direction than what Dr. Johnson was going in. Similar to my first question, as a Black male masculinist, say that word again. I'm sorry, I'm tripping up on my words. Masculinist, yes. How do we, in a similar way, project our values, stand up for ourselves, and also challenge the bad apples in our group, right? So I hear what you guys are saying, and at the same time, I think about the call them misguided youth who's out there spewing all types of anti-Black woman, misogyny commentary.
Yes, sir.
But that person can be, like I said, you can have a brother like Dr. Johnson, who has, legitimate concerns about the way Black men are being treated. But then you also got this, this misguided youth who's just spewing all types of, basically not helping the conversation, right? You know how that is. Like if you're arguing with someone and then your friend comes in and he just starts, saying stupid shit. I mean, stupid stuff. It just messes up your whole argument. And it's just like, how do we, because like I said, I see your point. And like I said, I can see both sides. When I hear the sisters complaining about the men, okay, I can understand what they're saying. You see the men talking about, their frustrations with the women, I can understand what they're saying. But at the same time, because, like for me, I got a lot of, good women, I don't have, put it this way, I have a lot of positive relationships with the women in my life. I guess I'm one of the lucky ones, I guess. And, I don't want some knucklehead to say some foul shit and then now I got to answer for it. But then I have legitimate concerns, but I don't want, how do we keep our legitimate concerns being conflated with,
I hear you.
Okay.
I hear you. No, it's interesting because you talk about the individual women, who are good women. And then you're talking about the men who come in and mess up the argument. And I see it the other way in rooms where the men often don't really know what to say. And the women come in with some very problematic things that they've been socialized and programmed with from birth. But first, to address your point before I respond to that, I'll say this much. The only thing you can really do is to model the argument in a manner that you believe to be more effective. I try to remain, I try not to go into an emotional direction where I'm yelling and screaming. I try to keep to the data, I try to keep to the argument and just kind of eliminate the hostility. But I will say at the same time, I understand it. And the reason this is something that his name escapes me. I'm not even gonna try to call it up. But anyway, this is something I've seen where when men finally figure out that they're not crazy and these things actually have a valid argument underneath it, but they didn't know how to articulate it, you're going to get some intense emotion. And this is across race. This is not limited to Black men by any means. It may present itself as emotional and illogical and frustrating and it messes up the argument. But really what you're dealing with a lot of the time are men who are finally figuring out for the first time that they've been lied to and that they're not crazy. Or what's the term people use now? They've been gaslit. You know what I mean? They figure out that they've been gaslit and they are livid because now you're looking at your mother, you're looking at your girlfriend, your sister, you're looking at the women even in your close proximity, and you are in many instances finding out that they have been participating in something that has been a problem for you individually and to the collective of men around you, and yet it's received as acceptable. So there's going to be a lot of frustration, especially as men are finding their footing in this. So I recommend the best thing you can do is model how to put it into a cogent argument and articulate it in an attempt to have an engagement. And hopefully that can be responded to. But I wanted to say also, though, when I talked about a moment ago how we were coming at this differently, what I've been seeing, for example, is you got a 17-year-old sitting in class. And one of the things I'll ask the men, how many of you have a list of requirements for who you date? In the last 10 years, I've not had one male raise his hand and give me a list of requirements on who he dates. Men, men are not asking for Beyonce. Men are not requiring that every woman that they meet has to be a 10. That's not something that I see happening with men. But at the same time, when I ask women, how many of you have a list of requirements for the men? They all raise their hands.
They all raise their hands, yes.
And when you ask them to articulate their list, the first thing they mention is that he needs to make 6 figures. Now understand, you could be talking about a first-generation college student whose family has never made more than $35,000 a year. She is 17 years old, requiring that the man she dates, often the 17-year-old guy sitting next to her, has to be making 6 figures now to be worthy of her. Men are not often making those kind of requirements. So I'm not saying that you can't have good women in your life. I do. I'm not saying that every dude is a jerk when he gets excited, but I am saying I'm responding more to how we've been socialized and programmed. When it comes to dating, mating, and family formation, one of the things that we are dealing with now is a list of requirements that I've been hearing since the 1980s. We're talking 50 years of he needs to make 6 figures. He needs to own his own home. He needs to have, this list of what men need to require to be worthy of dating an average woman. This is one of the fundamental things that men are so frustrated by, because it's not realistic. When you actually look up the percentage of people who even make six figures, and six figures in the 1980s, but yeah, six figures in the 1980s was a very different thing than in 2024. I mean, now if you make low six figures, it just means your bills are paid. It doesn't mean you go into the south of France every 6 months to kick it. It's not how that rolls. But when people make it a requirement, when across race you have 8 to 10% of people making that amount, and the average Black family with multiple incomes is usually under 40, if not, at best 50,000. The rates are relatively low when it comes to that. But when you have these unrealistic kind of standards being imposed on Black men in a society where we have very limited wealth and inherited wealth at that, how do you form unions?
Well, and I'm gonna tap in very quick, because you're making a great point, because probably about a year ago, and I don't know, LMA, if you had subscribed to my channel at that time, a sister came on and said, well, we don't have access to wealth. There are a number of historical, contemporary, structural reasons why this is the case. And I said, so what do you want us to do? She said, well, do what white men do. And I said, well, they committed genocide to get that type of power. She said, well, you all need to do the same.
Wow.
And I said on my channel, I said, this woman is not a friend of Black men.
Well, think about it this way. If our grandmothers and great-grandmothers required the six figures of their day, would we be here?
No.
But these are the kind of and the reason I bring this up is not to villainize the one or two women that said these things recently. What I'm saying is that behavior and those set of standards have been normalized in such fashion that a wide variety of women are saying this because they've been programmed with it
to do so.
You don't hear men talk like that. You don't hear men saying that every woman I meet, she needs to be an 8, 9, or 10, or I ain't gonna deal with her. It's not how that go. That's not how that go. This is not, it's not an even playing field. So you're gonna have frustration from men, especially men who are just now figuring out that they're not crazy, that there has been something going on where, it's not rainwater that's being spilled on your head. It's urine, and at some point it's going to be frustrating to figure that out. And first it be able to articulate it. But if you can at least model what it means to articulate these issues and do it well, using data, using history, using analyses that merit reflection, hopefully you can change the discussion. But that's where I come from with it.
Right, absolutely. And so we're going to stay on for about another 10 minutes, and then of course we're going to let Dr. Johnson come up for air.
I have a 5:15 that I need to get to.
Okay, so so this will be the last question, because he has a 5:15 class. So last question, Mr. Sandman.
Oh, okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks for letting me up there, and it was a great show this evening, and I really enjoyed it. From the doctors, both you and Lumumba and Dr. T. Yeah, so I see like a variety of issues with the situation that we're dealing with here in the United States, and I think our biggest issue is culture. Because being that I was in the military for some time, and I've been around the world a little bit, and got to be involved or go into different communities or different cultures around the world. I noticed one thing that a lot of other cultures possess that we as African Americans in the United States, we don't really possess, is a historical context to know where they come from. So, for instance, I was stationed in Korea for 2 years.
Mm.
And in Korea, I know a lot of GIs or Army soldiers who wanted to maybe dabble in finding themselves a Korean lady to marry, what have you. But in Korean culture, is against their culture for Korean women to marry outside of their own culture. Because so really what it is the history, their lineage is more important than anything to them. So by us as African Americans not really knowing our lineage and where we come from, we can't really instill those cultural that cultural fabric to get passed down from generation to generation, have that be more important than what the simple or the childish things that we're going through here in the United States. Everything is about money as opposed to with it being about us as a group. You know, we don't see each other as family. We don't see each other as one group of people. We see each of ourselves as like free agents, you know, trying to get the most out of the Big Apple before, you know, our time's up, as opposed to, you know, being having the culture be more important than just our own material wants and needs.
Well, let me respond to something you were saying. One of the things, because I went to Korea in 94. I was a part of 25 high school, 25 college students brought to kind of smooth over relations with Koreans, because this was right after the uprisings in Los Angeles. So I went out there and got a chance to visit Korea, but I wasn't in the military. But that's when I first learned about the military presence in Korea, American military, and how many brothers were there, and the influence the brothers had. And one of the things I noticed across not only Korea, but a number of other countries where Black men have been going, is that there are starting to be unions and very small communities that are starting to develop in these spaces, even though, as you say, it may be against the culture for women to do this. At a fundamental level, women respond to men, and men respond to women. And if you plot two groups of men and women in a remote space, things are going to start happening. You know what I mean? Across language, across culture, and that kind of thing is happening. But the other thing I'll tell you is that when we start talking about passport bros, this has become something I've heard, you know, that's been popular in the last few years. But the first passport bros I ever met were conscious Black nationalists. I'm telling you, man, the first conscious brothers that I ever met, not conscious, but the first passport bros were conscious brothers. In other words, I'm in Africana studies, right? So my professors and whatnot would be married, would have wives, and their wives would be from various African countries, the Caribbean, South America, long before I even knew about the issues I'm talking about now, long before I even experienced them. I'm running into these cats. I mean, from Kwame Ture to Dr. William Little, the professor that raised, I mean, these men were engaged with communities all over the world, but often when they were married to women from different countries who were socialized to respond to masculinity differently than women in the West.
In a positive manner, yes.
Yeah, and so even though it's really being torn down as a problem now that men are going elsewhere, the reality of it is the most conscious brothers I ever met in my life had been practicing it for decades. They come back with a wife from, you know, from Ethiopia, from Ghana, from Nigeria, and you know, from Jamaica, and you know, and a lot of people just saw it as, well, that's just Africana studies, because that's the way we interpreted it. Oh, that's just Africa, you know, brothers are all over the world. But when I would sit down and get a beer in them and start having conversations, they would start telling you that the things I'm talking about in my book and the things I'm talking about that we deal with here, they went through that for 30 years before they started dating women in other countries. One of my professors, a Black Marxist brother in the Claremont colleges, man, when I got a beer in him and when he started talking, man, I heard the same stories that I was dealing with in relationships 30 years prior that he was dealing with. And now he's married to a sister from, I forget which country she's from, Northeast African, but I'm blanking on it right now. But my point is simply that I just thought these brothers were doing it because they were, you know, international and they were conscious. And
right.
No, it was actually in many instances very intentional.
Yes. They
went to those other countries looking for wives, and they had 30, and usually had at least one family here in America first. You know what I mean? They had
did that young lady's family agree with her marrying a foreigner?
Which you talking about the one I mentioned? Wait, which one?
The one that went to Africa or Ethiopia?
No, oh, you mean did the woman from Ethiopia, did her family agree?
Yes.
Yeah, her family agreed, and here's the twist, and you're right in raising this. They agreed primarily because he was American, and the idea was, and this is where I think you're going, and you're correct. The idea was he had money, right? So if he's able to pay, and I've met Muslim brothers, for example, who've married multiple wives from different countries. The idea with those families is that Black men, there's something wrong with Black men from their perspective, and they get it from TV. They get it from movies. They get it from music.
Yeah, I know, because I was just in Ghana earlier this year. So,
but they're willing to engage you if they think that you're going to be a sort of patriarch that can fund the family. So there is that dynamic. I'm not denying that. I agree with you. But what I'm saying is that, you know, again, if you're in a situation where what you're able to earn here is more than they can earn there. And what they're asking for from you is manageable financially, but you're willing to pay it because of the peace of mind that it brings with the type of woman who's been socialized in a different environment. Fair trade. What's the phrase? Fair trade is no robbery. Fair exchange is no robbery.
Yeah, I've heard that term before, or maybe that a willing victim isn't really a victim or something to that effect.
No, I mean, families negotiate this all over the world. I mean, whether it's prearranged marriages or just marriage, families will sit down, and this is not something we do in the West, right? We talk about love and romance, but around the world, a lot of marriages can't happen without family approval, and that's dictated by what resources are you willing to bring to bear. So the gentleman I'm speaking about, the professor that I had when I was at the Claremonts, yeah, he had to pay a dowry, I believe it was, and he had to support the family over in certain ways. I'd send them a certain amount of money at different points in time. It wasn't anything extreme or crazy. It was something he could afford. But more importantly, he felt the exchange was worth it. You know what I mean? So
yeah.
But at the end of the day, all I'm saying is, options are opening up, and Black men find themselves sought after by women all over the world. And many Black men have ignored it until it got to a point where it was like, I can't keep doing this. I can't, especially after the second or third time you get married, you get divorced, you got kids that hate you, you got on child support, you're dealing with alimony. You get to this point where it's like, I just need a different culture. I can't, it's just not feasible. And this is something even white men were starting to figure out in the last couple of decades. Black men figured it out in the 60s. Marriage rates for Black men went down in the 60s. Even though we're still married to a greater extent than Black women, the marriage rates started to go down for Black men in the 60s. White men didn't start really picking this up till the early 2000s. And they were talking about, I got 3 divorces, 3 families that hate me. I'm paying child support. I'm doing this and that. And I don't know what I did what I was told. I got a job. I support my family. I thought I was being a good husband and father. And these women divorced me and take me to court. But Black men figured this out decades prior.
Yeah, we even talk about maybe another show, weaponizing, fatherhood in terms of, the expectation as a father is that you're going to be a disciplinarian, you can provide structure, and oftentimes raising a child in a manner in which they see that as something that is negative, something that is pejorative, that you're disciplining me because you hate me, right? So those are conversations that maybe we could have as well. But I don't want to hold you up, Dr. Johnson. I know you say you got a class that you're about to teach in about 3 minutes, so.
Well, I have to run, but I really did. I enjoyed this exchange. I can say, Mr. Sandman, that I didn't know that was a painting when I was seeing it in the comment section. I was jealous of your beard for half the show until I saw it was a painting. So,
well, actually, it's one of those AI paintings. But yeah, I did have that beard.
Well, then I'm jealous all over again, man.
I'm sorry about that.
And LMA, I appreciate your engagement in this, and I know I'm going to mispronounce it, but I think it's Say or Saeed Carey in the comments. I appreciate her comments.
Carey, absolutely.
Thank you for your involvement, and most particularly Dr. Lumumba. I appreciate the invitation. You've been very hospitable, and I really appreciate that, good brother.
No problem. Thank you very much, and I will. Hopefully, we could, collaborate. I think possibly, maybe we could work on an article. Walter Rodney wrote a book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. I'm thinking maybe we could work on something titled How America Underdeveloped Black Men.
Well, we'd have to check with oh goodness. Oh man, my memory's been so horrible lately. The brother passed away a few years ago, but he wrote a book about Malcolm X that really pissed everybody off.
Oh, you're talking about Manny Marable. Yeah, he's from my hometown, Dayton, Ohio.
Yeah. He wrote that book already though, back in I want to say the 80s, but powerful book. Anyway, How Europe Underdeveloped Black America. But we can talk. You got my number. You know how to reach me. And we can keep going from here, man. But thanks a lot, bro.
No problem. Thank you very much. All right. Family, you all know what to do. Until next time, y'all know what to do. Always bet on Black. Peace.